Hi, I'm Chuck Coletta, and I've been assigned to brief you on 1979's The Life Story of Superman.
DC Secret Files. DC Secret Files. Dead men and questions and villains so vile. Spectres and manhunters age on the dial. Mysteries, mayhem uncovered in style. Making their way through the pile. One by one we'll go through. DC Secret Files.
So far, it seemed like the trail of Golden Age superheroes was what caused the irredeemable Shag and myself to run afoul of some nefarious elements in the United States government. Actually, at this point, it would probably narrow things down if I pointed to benevolent elements in the US government. Never mind the sprawl of original and annexed Golden Age characters to sort through. Right before Shag was incarcerated on trumped-up charges and then disappeared outright, Captain Entropy helped me to do a deep dive into one of the original and most long-lived DC vigilantes, the Batman. Nothing unusual stood out there, and I've obviously, if briefly, looked at the progenitor of them all, Superman. And yet, it would take a world-class mastermind to engineer the type of shadow conspiracy that I'm now on the run from. You could say a Superman-class threat. I think I need someone to help me give the Man of Tomorrow the type of inspection that was afforded the Dark Knight detective. From Shag's remote swampland Florida hideout, I went through a Rolodex of our mutuals to find someone with the credentials to delve deeply into Kryptonian lore. Surely the professor of pop culture himself could provide me with a Man of Steel dossier, and he would get my dated Rolodex references besides. Welcome all to DC Secret Files, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe, 1993 through 2011, although I understand I'm definitely bending that a little bit in these early episodes. We're doing this because Rob and Shag refused to move past 1992, although again, we're playing in Bronze Age fields, Silver Age fields right now. Give me a little bit of slack, would you? As always, a big thanks to Luke Dobb for our bodacious theme song. On this episode, we'll be looking at a span of entries across the Golden, Silver, Bronze, and Modern Ages. I'm your host, Yalu Frank, but I won't be going it alone. Joining me is the literal professor of pop culture, Chuck Coletta!
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. I really be glad to talk to you tonight.
It's great to talk with you again. We've recorded once previously on Dick Tracy, and I was curious, are you reading any of that Mad Cave stuff?
Yeah, I am. I'm not thrilled with it, but I'm glad to see any Dick Tracy being published, so I'm sticking with it.
It was on my bubble. I read the first trade, and I was debating on whether or not I was going to get the second one. I don't understand why they moved it to the 50s. It makes no sense to me.
No, and it suffers from the problem where you've got to throw in every villain, every classic villain in there. The Dick Tracy comic strip is still fun. I still read that most days, so I'm doing that too.
Who's doing that these days?
I believe still Mike Curtis is the writer, and the artist has changed recently. It was Joe Staton for a long, long time, and he was great. And they've had a couple of changes since he left, maybe about 2 years ago or so.
Staton was working with Collins back in the 90s, right?
He may have been. I'm not sure.
He went back decades, though, didn't he?
I think he did for quite a long time.
Yeah, wow. You're going to be around an episode with the irredeemable Shag. Did you ever record with him?
No, I've done with Rob a bunch of times, but never with Shag for some reason. I don't know why. He doesn't want me.
Well, I think Rob deals in a particular vintage, and yes. Shag tends to be a little more 80s centric, where I think the movie podcast and stuff is maybe more your lane. Trust me, he'll get around to you sooner or later. I'm really glad I'm finally getting to talk to you, but I want to give a little bit of backstory. When I was coming up with this show, my original idea was to have this be part of the Firewater Podcast Network, and I asked a couple of their all-stars to be the co-hosts, and that did not happen. After getting refused twice, I was looking for who would be my first guest to appear on this show, while I was still kind of formulating what the first episodes were going to be. And because of our experience with the Dick Tracy episode, and just because you're a great conversationalist and somebody who I know is quite wizened in this area, you were the first person I ever asked to do the show. However, once we got to talking, I realized that you were really more of a Silver Age guy than the Golden Age stuff I was working with, or at the very least, you wanted to talk about the Silver Age more. And I knew that area was going to need to be worked over, and I really wanted somebody who would have a passion for it. You had to put up with months of me
Well, I'll get back to you. Oh, I'm still trying to figure it out, blah, blah, blah. So I just want to say thank you for your patience with me on this. And I'm glad to finally get to talk to you. And I wanted to let you know you were the first person I thought about once I realized we were going to do the rotating guest bit.
I'm sorry you were that desperate. No, but I'm glad to be here. I've listened to your podcast. They're great. I'm glad to be a part of it.
I'm glad you enjoy them. And also, again, this has changed over time because the original idea was I was reaching out to you for Golden Age material. We moved into the Silver Age, and we were going to cover Superman and Batman Magazine #2 because I'd already worked out that Shag was going to do #1. But then I really wanted to get to talk about Superman singularly. I didn't want to have to be bogged down with a bunch of extra stuff. And I really wanted to get into the lore of the character pre-Crisis. Now, I wanted to ask you, though, you're a Superman guy. When did you first get exposed to Superman, and what era do you most embrace? Am I correct that it's the Silver Age?
Pretty much the Silver and Bronze Age. And I still read Superman occasionally today. I'm reading the Mark Waid stuff, and I like his take on Superboy. I really got into comics basically in the early 80s, but not long after the Superman movie came out with Christopher Reeve. And that's when I started buying comics. I was always more of a DC guy. And so I was right there that last couple of years before the Crisis came. But I've been reading Superman off and on decades now, longer than I care to admit.
Awesome. Now, tell me this. As a Superman guy, did you ever go back to the Golden Age? Do you have any affinity for that material?
Oh, yeah. I'm actually speaking to you from outside of the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. So Superman is all over. In the state of Ohio, you can get a Superman license plate, a Superman logo on your license plate. And it says, I think, Truth, Justice, and the American Way. They just recently erected, after decades of talking about it, a Superman statue downtown. And last summer, they were filming the new movie all over town. So Superman's always been a part of growing up here in Cleveland. And I have read a lot of the Golden Age stuff. I've collected some of the old archives and things like that.
There's some debate recently. A lot of people are trying to claim Metropolis as their own. Do you still see Cleveland in modern Metropolis, or do you think that the other cities' influences have stolen it away from you guys a little bit?
A few of the early stories, I believe, had some Cleveland landmarks in it. They moved away pretty quickly from that. But there is a big push in recent years that Cleveland is the birthplace of Superman. If you come to our airport, Hopkins International Airport, and you go to the baggage claim, there's a big Superman statue there. We have a huge collection at the Cleveland Public Library. A donor a few years ago donated this massive collection of comics and merchandise and toys and things. And so they have some of that stuff on permanent display. But if you're watching the new Superman movie, Cleveland, especially downtown Cleveland, is all over that. You see Public Square, the Terminal Tower, the bridge where he saves the woman in the car. I've driven over that bridge 1,000 times. It's kind of a shock to see Superman flying around our local landmarks.
And if nothing else, you'll always have the Hall of Justice.
Actually, that's in Cincinnati.
Oh, my bad.
But it's still Ohio. It's still Ohio.
I drove through Cleveland. I didn't make it through Cincinnati, but we drove through at night. We didn't really get to stay long. And I've always regretted that. I really want to get to Ohio again one of these days and do a little bit of touring, hit some of the major landmarks. I really feel like that was a missed opportunity at the time, but it was my first major multi-state road trip where we were doing it on our own and not like a parent taking you someplace. And I just didn't plan for it the way I did some of the later trips. I really feel like I missed out. I really want to hit some of those landmarks you talked about.
Yeah, the only one that I would mention, and you can't go into it, but the house still exists where Superman was created. There's a family that lives there in the Glenville neighborhood. And the house was in really disrepair maybe about 10, 15 years ago. The group led by Stephen Colbert and others put money in to save the house and bring it up to snuff. And they have a Superman fence and plaque so you can't go in and knock on the door to see. There's nothing to see. People live there. But there are some Superman things around town that you can go and experience.
Awesome. I want to do that. I'm looking forward to doing that. And, it's not just Superman stuff, but Superman is definitely a priority for me.
Oh, good.
On episodes where we don't have an issue of DC Secret Files to cover, we like to anchor the discussion with another type of secret origin tale without stepping on the good work of Ryan Daly's Secret Origins podcast. Mostly I like to take these jaunts as an opportunity to look at the first 50 years of DC Comics before we give ourselves over entirely to the rebooted continuity that came after Crisis on Infinite Earths. This time, we set the Wayback Machine to the October 1979 cover-dated Action Comics number 500 for one of the last great retellings of pre-Crisis Man of Steel lore. By this point, it had been clearly established that there was a Depression-era Superman who had adventures on a different Earth in the then infinite DC multiverse. That said, the differences between these two versions of Superman didn't really begin to play out until 1973, when the graying elder Superman first took part in the annual Justice Society Justice League team-ups. Otherwise, this yarn is more or less everything there was to know about the combined Golden and Silver Age Superman lore. The Superman story, I might say, which Tor Books very much did when they re-released this comic as a paperback edition. For those unfamiliar, for a few decades, the closest most comics came to a trade paperback reprint edition was when a book publisher would reformat some key comics into hardcovers or softcovers for the bookstore market. One of the oddest manifestations was to rework a comic into a paperback that could fit in your back pocket. These books were typically in black and white. Rather than being a one-for-one comic page reprint, they would take individual panels and rearrange them to better fit the smaller book dimensions while remaining readable. Captain Entropy and I previously discussed when this was done to The Legend of the Batman, which at least kept the miniseries' title and one of its covers. With the Tor edition, they changed the extra-length single-issue tale, The Life Story of Superman, into The Superman Story, with a wraparound cover that was an altered version of a merchandise image drawn by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez for the 1982 DC Style Guide, reprinted in hardcover last year by Standards Manual. It's likely that the Superman story was among the most widely circulated versions of Superman's origin to non-typical comics readers, certainly at the time. According to Mike's Amazing World of Comics, Action Comics number 500 was released on July 19, 1979. It featured a whopping $1 US cover price for its 64 pages, no ads, wall-to-wall edition. The cover claimed 68 pages, but it counted both the exterior and interior cover pages. The inside covers offer the text-only piece, The Action Comic Story, a history of key features from the run of the title, written by E. Nelson Bridwell. He was also an associate editor on the book, working under Julius Schwartz. The key cover art was provided by Ross Andrew and Dick Giordano. It's an infinity cover with Superman standing tall, hands on hips, but looking cockeyed with a grin at Lois Lane and Supergirl holding a sandwich board-sized version of the same repeating image. Behind them is a fuchsia surprint of previous Action Comics covers. This extends to the back cover, which specifically showcases the 4 prior anniversary covers for Action number 100, 200, 300, and 400. There's also a full cover image of baby Kal-El rocketing away from the dying planet Krypton, and trust that this is the old-timey blue and red bomb rocket. So, how did you end up with this comic?
I think I probably first had the little paperback edition because the original came out just a couple of years before I was into comics. I definitely had that. Once I started getting into comics, I was 100% DC. I don't think I collected any Marvel. For some reason, I had really no interest in Marvel. I collected Superman and basically Batman Brave and the Bold. That's how I got to learn who all the characters were, who was Batman teaming up with. And so I remember going to a local comic book early convention at the Richmond Mall, just stacking up on all of those things. And so I really wasn't worried about complete runs. I just loved those characters. And that's where I became familiar with Bizarro and the Toyman and some of these other characters. But this Action Comics 500 was one of my favorites. I believe it was originally supposed to be a treasury sized, and they didn't do that. But it was everything you wanted to know about Superman in one booklet. And to top it all off, Curt Swan is one of my 2 favorite artists of all time. But when I close my eyes and think of what would my version of the DC universe look like, it would be Curt Swan and Jim Aparo, because those were just clean, straightforward comics to me.
We'll talk about Curt Swan in a bit, but Aparo I absolutely adore, and that's still my Batman.
Good. I approve.
But before we get to Superman, we're going to take a slight detour. We're going to look at the character of Shazam. Before we delve into the Superman story, I want to take a look at his greatest rival in comics, the Big Red Cheese. Captain Marvel was created for Fawcett Comics Whiz Comics number 2, cover dated February 1940. For the record, there was no Whiz Comics number 1, but rather a batch of low-print run ash cans meant to secure a trademark that all featured the same Shazam origin story, except they called him Captain Thunder. That name, and all the other prospective book titles, turned out to already be in use elsewhere. Therefore, the character was renamed Captain Marvel, and the same slightly altered story was used in the widely circulated first issue of Whiz Comics, which was just numbered at issue 2. The character, eventually to sometimes be known as Captain Marvel, was created by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck, though he'd largely be defined by writer Otto Bender. Billy Batson was an orphan paper boy living on the streets when he was lured into a subway by a mysterious stranger. Unlike the horrors that we usually expect from that premise, the man in the green coat turns out to be a wizard.
seeking a virtuous champion for mankind. Billy was gifted the powers of Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. To become a virtual Superman, when uttering the wizard's acronymic adoptive name of Shazam, young Billy changes into an adult body which, depending on the version, may be his older self, his deceased father's body, or an entirely separate individual. That's actually more the case in the Golden Age. Captain Marvel has most of the same abilities as Superman, but I think he flew first, and doesn't have any of the vision powers. However, he can call down magical lightning, a weakness of Superman's that the Captain has exploited on occasion. Captain Marvel can also give magic words to his friends and family to share his power, and often did in the Golden Age. In the 1940s, the Marvel family routinely outsold Superman comics to the tune of millions of copies. Plus, he starred in one of the all-time greatest movie serials in 1941, 7 years before Superman's own serial. However, a copyright infringement suit corralled Captain Marvel's success, and when superhero comics fell out of favor, it was settled with the cancellation of the Marvel family titles in 1954. DC Comics licensed the character in the 1970s, and there were multiple seasons of live-action and animated adventures in that period. DC finally bought Captain Marvel outright, but only after Marvel Comics had claimed the trademark, which is why everybody identifies him by the magic word instead of his superhero name. Our first secret file of this episode is actually the Hero File, from the spring 1994 edition of Superman and Batman magazine, issue number 4. Regular listeners may recall that the Irredeemable Shag and I covered the first issue of Superman and Batman magazine, and Chuck and I were originally going to do the same, before I asked to do a more Superman-centric special. The Shazam Hero File was written by Scott Peterson and drawn by Ty Templeton. The main image is Captain Marvel flying up into darkness from what appears to be the craggy surface of the Rock of Eternity. Most hero files were designed to be cut out and saved in a 3-ring binder, with little white punch holes indicated. This paper stock is a lot more flimsy than what was used on the loose leaf Who's Who edition, so good luck with that, kid. The reverse page offers full figure drawings of Dr. Sivana, hunched over and rubbing his hands together in anticipation of evildoing, as well as a gloomy Black Adam, giving a Kubrick stare with his hands and fists at his sides. Templeton makes the costume a solid black silhouette with gold highlights, a nice economic choice. Right off the bat, what did you think of the artwork used here?
I really liked it. I did collect that Superman Batman magazine. I don't know where the heck I got it. It must have been on a local newsstand or at the local drugstore or something, but I did have most of them for a long time. And these characters sort of lend themselves to a cartoony look anyway, and so I think it's perfect. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I like that big brawny image of Shazam. I'm saying Shazam because 70s kids, that's what we grew up with the TV show and everything. And it reminds me that Mike Wieringo and Jerry Ordway were originally going to collaborate on the Power of Shazam ongoing series after the graphic novel. Unfortunately, that never happened. It would have been gorgeous. A shame that, well, if we couldn't get Mike Wieringo, it would have been nice to have gotten Ty Templeton since he's doing a pretty good job of evoking Parobeck. But especially if he were inked by Jerry Ordway, that would have been fantastic. I'm sorry they didn't go that route.
It's always been a shame, among other reasons, but Mike Parobeck died so young. And just when his career was really getting going. And he was one of those artists that it's like a kind of an Alex Toth thing. It's very simple and clean, and it's just the essence of those characters. And I just wish that we had much more of his work available to us. But unfortunately, he passed away much, much too young.
So tell me a little bit about your background with the character of Captain Marvel, though. Where were you first exposed to him?
I'm in my mid-50s, unfortunately, or fortunately. I do remember watching the Shazam show on Saturday mornings. I was well aware that it was low budget and, there weren't many special effects and the gods were basically, just one drawing. There was a Shazam cartoon on, I think, on Saturday mornings in the early 1980s. I've always liked Shazam or Captain Marvel. I read the Jerry Ordway series for quite a long time. I'm sure a lot of people know that Captain Marvel, as he was called then, for a while there outsold Superman. His stories, when you look back at them now, are very whimsical and almost like fairy tales, and they're not strictly superhero adventures. But I've always liked the character, and I've even liked the more recent version that Jeff Johns sort of updated the characters a few years back, and he had a series that that just ended again, which was really good, but Captain Marvel Shazam doesn't seem to be able to sort of maintain a long run. But the character is really a heck of a lot of fun if you're in the right mindset.
Well, it's kind of tricky too because he's published by DC Comics, and so much of what defined Captain Marvel basically got borrowed by Superman in the 50s. And so you're already getting it via Superman. You don't need Captain Marvel as a delivery system for a younger version of Captain Marvel, a girl version of a Captain Marvel, and so on and so forth.
That's right. Was it C.C. Beck was writer on a lot of those things? And he went to Superman, I believe. And so a lot of those 1950s stories with Krypto and Comet the Super Horse and Super Monkey and all of that Supergirl stuff was just an extension of what they had been doing, a little bit softer in the 1940s. But Captain Marvel, I think the biggest mistake that they did was when they brought him back in the 70s, they tried to make it like he had been in the 40s. Very innocent and very corny. And I think the culture had just moved on. I don't like it when Captain Marvel or Shazam is presented as this idiotic sort of Mickey Rooney, Andy Hardy character from the 40s. He was a teenager. I think they've done a better job in recent series of putting him where he's supposed to be. But like you said, it's difficult to have him and Superman in a story together because they overlap so much.
Yeah, I always had issues with Captain Marvel, for starters, because I came into comics not too far from you in that same general time period. But at that time, that series was already wrapped up. And those back issues were not circulating in my experience. I didn't start seeing those until the late 80s, early 90s in comic shops. My exposure to Captain Marvel was mostly like house ads. You know, I would see when they would do the list of all the treasuries and stuff, I'd see him there, particularly the shot where he's got his arm resting on Billy Batson and they're standing on a rock. I might have maybe seen a Famous First Edition as a kid, but I really don't remember that. So I think there's more house ads talking about it, house ads talking about the TV show. I very rarely saw the live action show. It did run, I think, on weekends. I do remember watching the cartoon, though. I think it was on CBS. I watched a little bit of that. And of course, it was superhero content. And we were all so desperate for superhero content that, yeah, if it's just a matte painting of a bunch of gods, that's still enough for us. So certainly a cartoon I was there for. But I think it was early in the morning and I didn't catch it regularly. And he just wasn't as much a part of the zeitgeist as Superman, especially after the Superman movie. So it was just always like, here's Superman and here's this other guy who wears red. You know, I always had kind of an issue with that. And it wasn't really until I started going to the library, and one of the libraries I was going to had the DC Archive editions. That's where I finally got to exposure to the Golden Age material. And that's when I realized, oh, okay, I see where this guy's coming from. I see what makes this person more entertaining and unique. And I really enjoyed those Golden Age stories. I didn't get as deep into it as I would have liked to, but I could see where he was different from Superman and really enjoying that aspect. And it helps when he can be the hero of Earth S as opposed to being just another hero on the main Earth. So I think that's one of the issues. Also, Captain Marvel, I think, thrives in a more amused environment, a more fantastical environment, maybe even more of a fantasy setting. And so he needs a world that will allow him to be his most Captain Marvel. And I don't think the DC universe really accommodates that very well.
No. Whenever you're revamping or when they're revamping the character, they find a way to bring in Mr. Talkie Tawny, and it's a tiger wearing a suit. And one of his great villains is Mr. Mind. He's a worm with Coke bottle glasses and a little old-fashioned radio. It's ridiculous. I know they've tried to make it serious and jam it into the DCU, but like you said, I don't think it doesn't quite work. The tone has to be just right for that.
As I mentioned, there were two additional characters in the hero file. Dr. Thaddeus Bodog Savannah was introduced in the same issue of Wiz Comics as Captain Marvel, which, despite the 1940 cover date, was most likely released in December of 1939. That means Captain Marvel had his own evil scientist nemesis about 4 months before Lex Luthor made the scene. Further, Luthor was introduced with a full head of short red hair and wouldn't go bald like Savannah until 1941. In the earliest stories, Savannah was just a bad brain with a thirst for conquest. Like the Marvel family, Savannah had his own literal family of mostly squat, buck-toothed, nearsighted ne'er-do-wells, including daughter Georgia Savannah, son Thaddeus Jr., the hulking Magnificus, and the unearthly gorgeous Butea, former Empress of Venus. When the Fawcett properties were brought out of a near 2-decade publishing hiatus through a license to DC Comics, their absence was explained through the Savannahs. Basically, the bad guys plotted to trap the Marvel family and their closest friends in a substance called Suspendium. Through a mishap, the Savannahs were also trapped in suspended animation with the Marvels in the 1950s and reawakened with them in the 1970s. Dr. Savannah was almost the leader of the Legion of Doom, but he was instead set aside until his 3 appearances on the 1981 Shazam TV cartoon. Savannah actually turned up in live action first, debuting in multimedia on the 1979 NBC primetime special, Legends of the Superheroes, played by Howard Morris.
What experience do you have with him, and what are your thoughts on him?
He was always the classic mad scientist. I think that was part of the lawsuit that ran for years, that he was a bald mad scientist like Luthor was. But I think the most interesting thing about Savannah was, if I'm not mistaken, he knew pretty quickly who Billy Batson really was. And then you went into the background with his children. He had two sets, a boy and a girl, and then another boy and a girl. Well, the first set looked like him. They were kind of ugly and craggy, and the other ones were Beautia and Magnificus. So he was a lot of fun, but he was never really like a threat. He was a cartoon villain. He did his thing, but I never was like afraid of what he was about to do. He was just there to be the antagonist. And I think one of the problems was they used him a lot. He gets a little tiresome after a while.
Going with the Lex Luthor parallels, because obviously Lex Luthor owes something of a debt to Savannah, but Luthor went long periods of time without being seen, where Savannah was like the constant threat. But as you said, he's more of a cackling, maniacal villain, but not really like somebody who's going to do horrible, terrible things and turn you off on him. So it's almost like a Gargamel kind of situation. It's a situation where you've got a guy who's just part of the cast, who's the adversary of the cast. He can't be so menacing that you don't want him on your screen anymore. And over time, Lex Luthor became like that. Like you look at shows like Smallville and such, where he's there in the earliest days of Superman. They're going to school together. They're buddies. They're dating each other's girlfriends. It's kind of a similar arc.
Right. Comparing him to Gargamel, that's spot on. I wish I had thought of that, but you're exactly right. That's what he was. He was the antagonist. He claimed to be evil, but he was more ineffectual than anything.
The third hero file character, Black Adam, has a much shorter yet much longer history. Death Adam was the Wizard Shazam's champion in ancient Egypt, or was corrupted by his power and cast out by magic to the furthest reaches of space. It took him until December 1945's first issue of the Marvel family to fly back to Earth to seek his revenge on Shazam and his new champions. They fight to a standstill until the non-powered sidekick, Uncle Marvel, has the idea to trick Black Adam into saying his magic word. This caused Death Adam to revert back to his being a 5,000-year-old human, which is to say he immediately aged into dust. Black Adam didn't return until 1976's Shazam number 28, just 7 issues ahead of cancellation. He appeared in 5 more comics in the pre-Crisis period, plus a couple issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths. While he may have been an early example of a Black Mirror, I don't see that he directly inspired any Superman villains, though he served as one himself a fair few times over the years. Black Adam also managed a couple of appearances on the 1981 NBC cartoon series, The Kid Superpower Hour with Shazam.
Did you have much exposure to him growing up?
I didn't. If I'm not mistaken, Black Adam, I believe, only appeared one time in the Golden Age. And I think they brought him back in the 70s. But it really wasn't until Jeff Johns, maybe in the last 10, 15 years, that really built Black Adam up into a major character. And if you had ever told me, it's not great, but that they would one day make a Black Adam movie, boy, I would never have thought that was going to happen. But that shows you how sort of on the landscape he is out there now.
Yeah, and again, same with me. I did read an issue of the Roy Thomas, Tom Mandrake miniseries around 86. So I saw a little bit of him there. Some of his early 80s appearances and stuff, like I think DC Comics Presents or something, they were in the quarter bins in the late 80s. So I saw a little bit of that kind of stuff. But as you said, he really wasn't a thing for the longest time. And it really wasn't until the 70s material that I wasn't exposed to. So a lot of my exposure to Black Adam is really as a teen or adult. He just wasn't a presence for me as a kid. He doesn't resonate with me the same way he might for a younger generation that had seen him in video games, seen him in movies now. It's crazy. We just had a different exposure to this guy.
Yes.
Hey there, and welcome to Comic Geek Speak. My name is Brian, and with me here is Peter.
Hello.
We've been reading comic books forever. I'm going on, I must have been reading comic books since 6th grade, so 1986. I know a thing or two. Peter, what's your story?
I've been reading, I guess if you count the Richie Rich stuff, that's going back in the 70s, but superhero stuff probably since I think it's 1982, I want to say. 1981, 1982.
So you have me beat by a few years, and you definitely know more than I do, as we've proven in the many trivia games that we've had. So we just thought, I've been checking out podcasts for a couple of weeks now, and I haven't seen any comic book related podcasts, so we figured, hey, let's do it because somebody else will if we don't. So we'll beat them to the punch, and maybe you'll end up listening to us for a long time.
Next, I want to talk about another great superhero that started out not only outside the Superman sphere, but also the DC Comics one. As with Captain Marvel, Plastic Man was created by a competing publisher, Quality Comics. Jack Cole debuted Eel Orion in 1941's Police Comics #1. And also as with Captain Marvel, Plastic Man was more popular than almost anything DC Comics published. Eel O'Brien was a gangster doused with a strange acid and left for dead in a heist gone wrong. He was nursed back to health by kindly monks, and found that the chemicals had given Eel the ability to stretch and transform his malleable, durable body into various objects. Taking revenge on his gang, Eel used his new powers to bring them to justice, and decided to stick with the straight and narrow. He began working closely with law enforcement authorities, and a petty crook named Woozy Winks eventually joined him as a sidekick on the side of Angels. Most of the classic national heroes were mothballed by 1948, but Plastic Man continued his own title into 1954, just as the Marvel family had, passing just shy of the Silver Age. All told, there were just under 300 comics with original Plastic Man stories. Unlike Fawcett, DC didn't wait around to buy out Quality Comics, and they even continued one of their series without missing a beat in 1956. Unfortunately, Plastic Man wasn't that comic, so he had to wait another decade before his revival. The first DC volume of Plastic Man jumped on the Batmania camp craze with a late 1966 debut by Arnold Drake and Gil Kane. This version was actually Eel O'Brien Jr., the goofy son of the original. The title was ill-conceived and poorly received, canceled after just 10 issues in 1968, with Jr. never darkening DC's door again. The original Earth 1 Plastic Man returned in a trio of Batman team-ups, beginning with 1971's The Brave and the Bold number 95. He got his own title in 1976, continuing the numbering of Jr.'s run, and doubling it before it was claimed by the DC implosion. In 1979, he picked up a slot in the anthology series Adventure Comics, lasting throughout 1980. There were assorted team-ups, and appearances between Earths 1, 2, X, and wherever Super Friends was set before Crisis on Infinite Earths hit. Despite a cameo in the third episode of Super Friends in 1973, Plaz had to wait until 1979 to get a proper cartoon. However, it was the Plastic Man Comedy Adventure Show, and ran 112 episodes across 5 seasons. So it seems to have been worth the wait. Just ask Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and the Martian Manhunter if they have enough combined solo cartoon episodes to compete. Our reference for this entry is from 2003's JLA-Z number 3, written by Mike McAvennie and drawn by Scott Morse. It features a wildly exaggerated cartoon Plaz making a sort of Rock'em Sock'em Robots boxing toy out of his hands, knocking a small representation of himself out with a punch. What do you think about this artwork and its representation of the character?
Well, I think it captures the tone really well. Plastic Man, kind of like Captain Marvel, was a humorous take. Plaz especially was a parody of superheroes. So this really captures that cartoony tone that those early 1940s stories were going for.
And so you've gone back and you've read the Jack Cole stuff?
I've read a bunch of it. I've read a couple of the archives, and when they do reprints of that, Jack Cole was a really talented, and personally troubled artist. When you read those stories, it's just someone whose imagination is going all over the place. The villains are wacky and sometimes scary. It really is like a cartoon. There's no seriousness in it. It's things are happening, but it's more fun. It's almost like a Looney Tunes take on superheroes.
Where were you first exposed to the character?
I think it must have been, was it in the late 70s that Plastic Man got a cartoon on Saturday mornings? I don't know if I'd ever heard of him before that, but I do remember the cartoon because I bought the DVD set, I don't know how many years ago. It's not great, and it's not really what the stories were about. They gave him a girlfriend and I think a Hawaiian sidekick, but that's where, and Baby Plaz, who I hated, but I remember him in the late 70s, early 80s Saturday morning shows.
Yeah, and I was just saying, I don't even think I'd seen him in the comic books before I saw him in the cartoon. And man, I hated that cartoon. I was just talking about how we were so hungry for superhero content. I watched tons of episodes of that cartoon, way more episodes of that than the Captain Marvel cartoon, in part because there were way more episodes produced. It was seemingly a much more successful show. But do you remember they had that live action host between the segments?
I do remember that now, but at the time, I don't remember that. I don't know how I missed that, or it didn't register. But yeah, I've seen that guy, and I think you can find some clips on YouTube.
Yeah, when they both in first run and in syndication, they had him as the host, and he was so smarmy with that horrible nasal voice. I couldn't stand that guy. The cartoons themselves were okay, but it was that host that really did it in for me. I could deal with Hula Hula. I could deal with Penny. I could even deal with Baby Plaz, although that was definitely putting things too far into the Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry sphere. Right. But I just could not deal with that host. And And I know a lot of people, again, I've mentioned Shag a few times this episode. Shag hated Plastic Man too, and I think for the same reasons I did. So I just held on to that hatred into adulthood. And then I read the 2001 book, Jack Hole and Plastic Man, Forms Stretch to Their Limits by Art Spiegelman with design by Chip Kidd. It was originally a 1999 New Yorker article that they expanded into a book.
Yeah, great book. I read
that is an incredible book. That completely turned me around on the character. It was so insightful. He absolutely was able to articulate why Jack Hole's creation was so awesome. And then I went back and read the Jack Hole material and realized, nobody's been getting this right for almost a century now. Like, no one at DC ever got this character right. Only Jack Hole ever got this guy right.
No, that's right. And Jack Cole, Plastic Man wasn't his only claim to fame. I believe, he was incredibly close to Hugh Hefner. And Hugh Hefner wanted him to be the sort of like the artistic or director, editorial guy at the early issues of Playboy, which he was. When Cole ultimately committed suicide, he left one note for his wife and one note for Hugh Hefner. And he could do a whole different variety of styles. That Playboy stuff is totally different than the comic book stuff. His one goal that he wanted was to have a syndicated cartoon strip. And the last maybe year or two of his life, he got it. It's called Betsy and Me. It's a very 1950s domestic suburban sitcom about a kind of not a henpecked husband, but kind of a put-upon husband and his blonde wife. It's cute and it's fun and it's lighthearted, and it runs for about a year. And then unfortunately he passed away, and that was the end of it. There is a small collection that you can get. It's well worth it if you want to learn more about his post-Plastic Man career.
Yeah, and it's an incredible range of styles too, because I don't recall, was he using map pencil or crayons or even some sort of painting on the Playboy material, the editorial material.
Yeah,
and of course he did the great line art and the comic books, and he did a bunch of stuff for Quality. He worked a lot with
Eisner.
Yes. He did a bunch of stuff with Eisner. He has a bunch of characters to his credit. And so he could do the comic book stuff. He could do the more cartoony, but also painterly material in Playboy. So he had a great range. I've never seen the comic strip you talked about, aside from probably some samples that were in the Spiegelman book. But yes, his art is still extraordinary to look at. It's beautiful. And thankfully, they just recently, the DC Finest line collected a bunch of that early material at a reasonable price. I think it's about $40 on the face value. I absolutely, completely recommend it. Go out there and pick up that book if you get the chance to pick it up. Sure, it's at in-stock trades or someplace at some fantastic deal. Take advantage of that deal. It really is worth it. And even if you don't like most Golden Age material, this is truly exceptional Golden Age material. It's timeless. It's much darker than you might expect. It's more mature than you might expect. The perspective on Plastic Man was a lot different. He was not the wacky, goofy Jim Carrey mask character that you see in modern comics. He was the straight man in a world that was crazy. So you're if you've only read or seen cartoons or read about Plastic Man in the DC sphere, you don't know who that guy is. He's a completely different character in his own stories. And it's just remarkable material. It's material that still is worth reading for modern readers today, I would say.
Oh, yeah. Well, the 1970s cartoon wasn't so great, but Plastic Man comes off pretty well in the Batman Brave and the Bold from maybe about 10 years ago. He was kind of a semi-regular in that, and I think they do his origin story in there. And so that was really good. If you want to see a good animated Plastic Man, he pops up like every third or fourth episode in the Brave and the Bold first season or two.
I have not seen as much of Brave and the Bold as I would have liked to. I wish I had been on top of that, because most every episode I've seen, I've absolutely loved. I love how much it embraces the whole history of DC and comes comes at characters from a different perspective than they have been in other places. Sometimes, like if you're an Aquaman fan, it might drive you a little nuts, their take, but at least it's a unique take that you had not seen before and very novel and entertaining. I really enjoy, I feel like that show had its heart in the right place, and I can enjoy that show in a way that I can't a lot of the other DC stuff, because it only takes itself so seriously, and as an adult, it's hard for me to take the superhero stuff entirely seriously. So characters like Captain Marvel and Plastic Man are a way in for me to enjoy this material in a way I can't over the nuttiest epic.
Yeah, just to give you one quick example, they had their version of Aquaman was kind of like Steve Reeves from the old Hercules movies. They did an episode where the Aquaman family was presented in like a sitcom. And they have a theme song, and it was almost not line for line, but it was the same tune to a long forgotten sitcom called The Pruitts of Southampton from about like 1967, starring Phyllis Diller. I'm probably the only person I know, I wasn't even alive then, who knows what that reference was. But I said, if they're making a reference to an old Phyllis Diller sitcom in an Aquaman episode, this is the show for me. It's just pure fun. I think, just to give you an example, I don't think there's only one episode where Batman takes off his cowl. So he's always Batman. In one episode, he's in a dirt bike race, and in the other episode, he's flying spaceships in outer space. So it's the Silver Age 1950s Batman mixed in with everything else.
And I think it's also important that you mentioned that they did the origin story in the cartoon. We have to point out that once again, DC outright stole Plastic Man's origin for the Red Hood, aka the Joker. It's just, it's the same origin. You know, come on, guys. You know,
that's right. I didn't think of that, but you're right.
Returning to Action Comics number 500, the life story of Superman began with a prelude by the creative team of writer Martin Pasko, penciler Curt Swan, and inker Frank Chiaramonte, with letters by Gaspar Saladino and colors by Adrian Roy. The Man of Steel himself appeared before the Superman Pavilion at the Metropolis World's Fair to guide a tour of his career with numerous museum pieces. The famous entrepreneur, J. Robert Arngrim, had offered $1 million to Superman's favorite charity in exchange for his help in developing the authentic displays. There was a heavy media presence among the tour group, including Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, television sportscaster Steve Lombard, and WGBS Evening News co-anchor Lana Lang. To inaugurate the event, Superman cut through a 6-inch ribbon of steel with his heat vision, then led the group to the Krypton exhibit. While Superman has a memory with nigh total recall, frequent exposure to kryptonite radiation has created gaps in his memory. In order to recall his toddler life on his homeworld, the Man of Steel used a mind probe array to help him bring to mind his few early memories of life on Krypton. Elsewhere, a masked, nefarious scientist was also exploiting the mind prober for an experiment involving a rapidly developing life form in a transparent tube. Did you have any thoughts on that particular segment of it?
Well, I just thought it was sort of like a nice touch that it's set in this kind of World's Fair type setting, and that was where Superman made one of his early appearances in live action at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. So it all tied together.
Yeah, I really wanted a narrative for us to talk about here, but one of the additions we did talk about was the world of Superman and the theme park that never came about and the layouts for that and all that other bonus material. And if you haven't gotten that treasure, definitely check that out. It's cool to see what could have been. I've enjoyed some Superman stuff in the past, some rides, like we've got one at Six Flags in San Antonio that I really loved, but it'd been so cool to have an actual, if not a full-on attraction, at least a segment of it, like they have it like Universal Studios, where you've got all the comic strip characters and stuff.
That's right. I believe, though, I saw online maybe about a year ago, there's like a DC World, I think it's like in Dubai, in a theme park. And like they have a Metropolis section and a Gotham City section, and they have the people dressed up like the characters. You know, if I could only get myself to Dubai, I'd go there. But you're right. That Superman proposed theme park, it would probably have cost him $1 billion then. So I don't think it was ever going to get off the ground. But it's nice to dream.
Absolutely. And I do like to travel internationally. I don't see Dubai in my future.
No,
but that's definitely a hook. You know, it's maybe one of these days. Since we just had a roll call for the Daily Planet staff, that can be our next entry. The Daily Planet is, of course, the newspaper where Lois Lane and Clark Kent work. It was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, introduced as the Daily Star in Action Comics number 1, but changed to the Daily Planet in 1940's Action Comics number 23 for no clear reason. It isn't on the Wikipedia page, but I believe that I recall the Daily Planet being a location in the 1940s The Adventures of Superman radio serial, and it was definitely a regular locale across 6 seasons of the 1950s TV show.
It was a key setting throughout all 4 of the original cycle of Superman motion pictures, beginning in 1978. The Daily Planet is also the name of the DC Comics editorial pages of the late 1970s and early 80s, including Bob Rozakis' The Answer Man column and Fred Himbeck's comic strips. This entry was featured in the January 1998 cover-dated Superman Secret Files and Origins #1. Written by Roger Stern and drawn by Steve Lieber and Jose Marzan Jr., we see a bustling newsroom with Perry White seemingly lost in thought while walking by, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. What do you think about this artwork?
It's okay. I don't know if this is what I would have chosen. I might have chosen more of the top line characters, but this shows you that it's a great metropolitan newspaper. I don't think it's too bad, but I don't know if this is the image I'd go with. It's not that exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of a dud. It's pretty boring. We've seen other versions of this. We've seen better versions of this, but it gives us a chance to talk about the Daily, but make sure I say the right one, Planet. Don't say the wrong one. Don't be in the wrong universe. I do not remember a time in my life where I was not aware of the existence of the Daily Planet. It was just always there. It was always in Superman media. It exists before any time that I have conscious thought. Do you remember ever your first exposure to the Daily Planet, or you're in the same boat as me?
No, I'm in the same boat. And it's funny you say that because I'm teaching a class this coming fall on superheroes and comics. And we touch on Superman in another one of my popular culture courses. And Superman's backstory, his supporting characters, the villains, they seeped their way into American mainstream popular culture more so than anybody else up for decades. I can tell you that if you had asked most of my college-age students 20 years ago who Tony Stark was, nobody would know. But back then, everybody knew Lois Lane was his girlfriend, and Don't Call Me Chief, and Jimmy Olsen, and all these other characters. They just were everywhere. They were on Broadway, they were on TV, on cartoons, on the radio. You could definitely not be a comic book reader and know all about Superman, basically the bare bones of the story. You could walk up to anybody practically and say, tell me the origin story of Superman, and they'll know it. So much a part of the culture. And I'm sure, we'll talk about it just for a moment, but Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen had their own comic books for like 20 years. That's amazing back then.
Yeah, I came across this when I was talking with Captain Entropy about the Batman supporting cast. And yeah, the very first Batman serial, you've got Commissioner Gordon in there. Superman was on the radio, so his supporting cast were either went with him to the radio or were invented for the radio. They appeared in the 50s TV show. They appeared in the movies. These guys have more appearances than most comic book superheroes. So you can't sleep on the cultural impact of these characters. Guys like Perry White, people know, like you said, they know who this guy is. They saw him in the 90s on Lois and Clark. This is an inescapable part of at least American culture and largely world culture.
Right. And even something sort of like as minor and innocuous as like, Great Caesar's ghost. People have heard that phrase, and it might not pop up to everybody, Superman, but a heck of a lot of them, it would. I wish more of those stories were reprinted. Some of those Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen stories are funny and kind of corny, but for what they are, they're fun.
And again, one of the biggest movies of the summer has Steve Lombard in it. It has Ron Troop. It has Cat Grant. You can't escape these people.
No, that's right. I wish they had been given a little bit more to do, but here we've got Jimmy Olsen, who's got, he's really integral to the plot of the new movie. It's amazing. All the different iterations of Superman in the last couple of years, the last 20 years, we had Smallville. There was a Supergirl TV show. There was Superman and Lois. It just goes on and on and on.
And that's a perfect transition into our next entry, Jimmy Olsen.
Among the chief Daily Planet staffers is club reporter and photographer Jimmy Olsen. He was introduced in the Adventures of Superman radio show in 1940, but the comics retconned that character into an unnamed blonde office boy that appeared occasionally in titles dating back to 1938's Action Comics number 6. He was officially introduced into comics in 1941's Superman number 13, and in 1954 was spun off into his own series, Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen, which ran 163 issues. Among the series' talents was Jack Kirby, who used the title to birth his Fourth World Saga, and this was where Darkseid was introduced. Like Superman's Pal, the solo series of Lois Lane and Supergirl were also canceled in 1974, so all 3 strips were combined into the new title, The Superman Family. That book continuing the numbering of the longest-lasting title, Jimmy Olsen's, and ran until 1982's number 222. James Robinson wrote a pair of Jimmy Olsen one-shots between 2008 and 2009, while Nick Spencer scripted another in 2011. The Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen title was revived for a 12-issue maxi series in 2019 by Matt Fraction and Steve Lieber. And the return for the 2022 one-shot, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen's boss Perry White. Much of the solo material featuring Jimmy Olsen has been collected over the years. But with something like 4,000 comics appearances, they'll never get to them all. Jimmy has appeared in pretty much every media adaptation of Superman ever. Even though he's sometimes a CIA operative who gets shot in the face by a terrorist after a few minutes of screen time, or is other times a smoke show black dude who becomes the Guardian. But usually he's a slightly dorky ginger, with freckles and a bow tie, who is clearly biting Archie Andrews' action. In radio, the character was originated by Jackie Kelk, who was replaced by Jack Grimes. Tommy Bond was the Jimmy of the 1940s movie serials, but the character was immortalized by Jack Larson across 102 episodes of The Adventures of Superman, from 1952 to 1958. In fact, Larson's version was so popular that after the unexpected death of George Reeves, the show's producers tried to pivot the show into a Superman's Pal series, employing archival footage and doubles for Reeves. Larson refused, and the character moved into animation with 1966's The New Adventures of Superman. Beginning in 1978, Mark McClure made a career out of playing Jimmy in all 4-period Superman motion pictures, and Supergirl besides. Jimmy continued to turn up in film, television, and animation. As I never tire of pointing out, more people have played Jimmy than Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and Martian Manhunter, probably combined. Some notables include Justin Whalen's 3 seasons on Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, David Kaufman voicing Jimmy in the Timverse cartoons and video games, Aaron Ashmore in 4 non-consecutive seasons of Smallville, Makad Brooks in 6 seasons of Supergirl, and most recently, Skylar Gisondo took him back to the silver screen for Superman 2025. We return to Superman Secret Files and Origins number 1 for the Jimmy Olsen profile page, as written by Roger Stern, with art by Tom Grummett and Denis Rodier. We see him in Mr. Action mode, dressed in cyclist gear while holding a helmet and seated upon some high-tech ride from Cadmus or New Genesis. In the clouds above him is a specter of his younger self, brandishing a professional caliber camera. Again, with Jimmy, do you remember being introduced to him? Was he just always there? And how do you feel about the character?
I always liked Jimmy Olsen, and I did not watch it regularly. Now, this was in reruns, but I probably first became aware of him, if not through the 1978 movie, but definitely the 1950s TV show with Jack Larson. Maybe 20, 25 years ago, there was a Superman postage stamp, and they unveiled it here in Cleveland, and Jack Larson was there, and I got him to sign my Superman book. He could not have been a nicer guy. Jimmy was a civilian, but he was Elastic Lad and all of these stories, and there was a lot going on with that character. He really was Superman's equivalent of Robin for many years. And I've always had a soft spot in my heart for him.
And for me, I do remember it was definitely the first Superman movie. I saw that one theatrically. So that would have been my first exposure. I never read a lot of the comic books that time period. And then, of course, reruns of Adventures of Superman. So Jack Larson is certainly familiar to me from that material. Jimmy was just always there. I very much slept on Jimmy Olsen as a kid. For me, it was just like, what is a civilian doing here? You're just getting in the way with your dumb signal watch, go get a job, that kind of thing. But as I've gotten older, I really appreciate what he brings to Superman and the fact that he has such longevity and he's so widely recognized. And I think part of it is just, I wasn't exposed to the good stuff. I feel like if I went back and read the Jack Kirby material from the late 60s, I'd be more into it. I might be able to get more out of it from the 60s material. And I understand too that he borrowed pretty heavily from Archie Andrews, but put him into a shared universe, put him into more action than, Captain Pureheart, whatever it is.
Right.
Better integrated into a superhero universe. And so I just feel like I missed that material some. And I will say, though, that I was more exposed to him in the comics through the post-Byrne reboot. And I like the guy fairly well there. I think when I actually read Superman comic books and he appears in those books, I fairly well enjoy the character. And I just wish I had gotten more exposure to the cream of the crop when it comes to Jimmy stuff. Because you don't have hundreds of issues of a comic book without having something worthwhile for people to be reading.
No. And, if you look at those old Jimmy Olsen covers, whatever was going on in the 1950s and 60s, teen culture, there's covers where he's going to be a part of the Beatles, or he's acting like Elvis, or the most infamous one is where Jimmy Olsen's going to marry a gorilla. There was a mini-series, I think it's by Steve Lieber, in the last couple of years, which was a Jimmy Olsen-centric, very Silver Agey, very much a love letter to those early 1950s, 60s stories. And that was a heck of a lot of fun. It's kind of in its own little world. I would highly recommend that one, that Jimmy Olsen miniseries. And then they had a Perry White one-shot to go with it.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that too. But I unfortunately, like you, I'm not reading a lot of the modern stuff. You're reading more of it than I am, to be honest with you. So there's a bunch of good stuff before my time, and I hear there's a bunch of good stuff after my time, and I just missed those windows, unfortunately.
Well, you're right. For the last few years, I cut back a lot on my DC books, very sparingly. I'm reading some of the Superman, and I'm reading the Mark Waid stuff because that's sort of my soft spot. But a lot of the DC current books, I'm not too keen on.
And it doesn't hurt to be drawn by Tom Grummett. He's one of my favorite comic artists, and he looks great here. This is the exact opposite of the Daily Planet. I look at this image, and I want to learn more about Jimmy Olsen.
Right.
I've been trying to watch all the Superman media. I want to do like a ranking of the Superman movies and such. And I'm surprised how much I like the guy from those early movie serials. I'm trying to come up with his name. Tommy Bond.
Oh, right.
He had such a unique face. I like he has that kind of nose that you don't really see much of anymore. They did a great job both with Lois and Jimmy, giving them a lot of stuff to do in the movie serials. And I think that was like, that kind of was revelatory to me of how you could effectively use Jimmy Olsen.
Right. If I'm not mistaken, I'd have to double check, but I think Tommy Bond was Butch in The Little Rascals. He was the bully who was always picking on Alfalfa and Spanky and Buckwheat. I don't know whatever happened to him afterwards, but I think that's what he was before Jimmy Olsen.
Very interesting. Maybe there's some memory there, because I definitely watched a lot of Our Gang when I was a kid. Do you have a favorite media, Jimmy Olsen?
I don't know if anyone stands out. What I've done over the last number of years, I have a book that's called Superman at 50. It came out during Superman's 50th anniversary, and I have been dragging it around to conventions for the last 25 years and getting various people to sign it, from Smallville, from the Noel Neal to Dana Delaney. If anybody's coming through Cleveland has got a tie to Superman, I'll get it. And they've all been very nice. But Jack Larson he was just a gentleman. He was took the time to, sign autographs for free at this event at the post office. He was exactly what you wanted him to be.
And by the way, do you have any exposure to some of the latter day Jimmys, like from Smallville and such?
The one that I've met I think his name is Sam Huntington. He was Jimmy in Superman Returns. My one claim to sort of fame, it's nothing, it only means something to me, is I teach at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And our most famous alum is the actress Eva Marie Saint, who recently turned 101. And she was Ma Kent in the Superman Returns movie. And so I've gotten to know her, and I went to a couple of various functions with her. And I got her autograph and his and a big Superman Returns kind of photo book that's kind of very hard to find. But I feel that I contributed. What I did was I gave her an information packet on who Ma Kent was and what Smallville was. I feel that's my claim to fame as a Superman creator.
See, I love that. And I also love that you picked Superman at 50. I was trying to find some sort of overarching theme for coverage of this early Superman material, or the pre-Christ Superman material. That's one of the ones I looked at. I've never actually held the book, never read the book, but it was a really cool image. And it seems like an ideal place to put all those signatures. So that's sweet.
Yeah. The book is a series of essays and articles, and there's one that you can find online that we read. It's in my school textbook, for example, not that I wrote, but I use in class. It's called What Makes Superman So Darned American? What is it about this character? What did Siegel and Schuster do, and the creators afterwards, to make this character so much a symbol for the United States? So much more so than Batman or, maybe Captain America, but Superman really does mean something to this culture of ours.
Truth, Justice, and the American Way. And also, I was on Blue Sky not that long ago, and there was somebody pointing out how much John Byrne, who relishes being a Canadian, reminds everybody that he can of his Canadian roots, but how much he enforced in Man of Steel and in the greater Byrne reboot, how American Superman is.
Right. He really is one of those. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a statistic I use in class all the time. Someone once said, I think back into the 70s, so it might have changed now, but the three most recognizable men who never actually lived were Superman, Tarzan, and Sherlock Holmes. Now, that's probably changed now, but you could ask a 3-year-old, and they know Superman, and so does their 93-year-old great-grandmother.
It's an incredible cross-section. And of course, that's reinforced in the movie too. It's that classic immigrant story where they weren't born here, so they're going to tell you from screaming from the rooftops, I'm so glad to be here though, and I've got your back, and I have no divided loyalties. I'm 100% an American.
Right.
We're going to look at the immigrant Superman. The life story of Superman continues into Chapter 1, Planet on the Edge of Oblivion. Because of his near total recall and with the help of the mind probe array, Superman can remember being a roughly 2-year-old toddler in the capital city of Kryptonopolis. Kal-El experienced the early earthquakes with his mother Lara, while his father pleaded fruitlessly with the ruling Science Council to build a fleet of space arcs to evacuate. As no one believed him, not even his brother Zor-El, Jor-El set upon modeling a smaller craft with available resources to try and save his family. The pet dog Krypto was sacrificed in one such test, as a meteor strike knocked that rocket off course. Months later, Krypton began to disintegrate, and there was only another small test rocket ready to launch. Lara could have potentially fit, but the drag of an adult body could have spent the rocket prematurely, and the mother wanted her son to have the best possible chance of reaching the planet Earth. Young Kal-El was traumatized by the last sight of his birth parents and his home world collapsing around him, causing Superman to weep and thrash about in today's retelling. Comforted by Lois Lane, the Man of Squeal led the tour on to the Superboy exhibit, which was heavy on the Legion of Superheroes, but light on details of his early life in Smallville. Meanwhile, nearby, the rogue scientist had aged his test tube Superman clone to adolescence. What do you think about this portion of the story, this chapter?
I liked it. And, this came out about a year after the movie came out. Kids would have been pretty familiar with the origin by now. I especially liked the fact that they kept the classic Silver Age Krypton and they didn't go for the Marlon Brando version, which I really liked too. But this was distilled Silver and Bronze Age Superman. I think, like you covered that untold legend of the Batman before. This is everything that you needed to know. If you'd never read a story before, here it is, and this will catch you up. And I like Superboy. I know there have been times where he's been erased and been revamped, but I like the Clark Kent in Smallville Superboy.
Especially after the Byrne reboot, where they made a point of, no, he was actually born here on Earth. The Matrix landed on Earth, and then he was born, and he's definitely an Earthling, and he's definitely a U.S. citizen and all that kind of stuff. I really like that he was a toddler in these stories. I like that he was born and raised up to a point on Krypton, remembers Krypton, longs for Krypton. I think it's an important part of who the character was pre-Crisis, and I really miss that aspect. I also love them going through and finding ways of no-prizing the story, where I'm sure people have been asking them, well, what about this? What about this? And I love how they kind of make a point of checking all those boxes here. They are anticipating what the kids are going to ask, so they've already retconned and fixed what they need to fix to make it work. So I really, really dig that. I really enjoyed this portion of the story. I enjoy all the Krypton stuff. I love Jor-El and Lara. I recently rewatched the 3-hour cut of Superman the Motion Picture. While there are some areas where it really drags, kind of wears on the nerves a little bit, I had no problem spending more time on that Krypton. I loved that version of Krypton. It was such a gorgeous image, the reds and the whites, everything is so beautiful. I still get chills listening to Marlon Brando read a Post-it note on a crystal somewhere, but he still pulls it off. And I really love the Jor-El of the comics too. I love the green, the green outfit and the symbol and the headband, all that. I really feel like we lost something when we got rid of that stuff. And while as a kid, I was never wild about Superboy, I really see his importance now, and especially with the ties to the Legion of Superheroes and how that influenced the greater evolution of superhero comic books. I feel like a lot got lost when this stuff got jettisoned.
Oh, yeah. Probably the first DC miniseries I ever bought that I don't think they've ever reprinted I think it was called the Krypton Chronicles, where it was Superman, like in 3 or 4 issues, looking at famous ancestors back on his home world. And Krypton was pretty vital into the stories on the Silver and Bronze Age. There were a lot of times when he would time travel back to Krypton, or he would go to Kandor and see some relatives and people who were, the old society. We did have sort of backup stories with Jor-El and Lara, so they were much more a part of the stories than some people might think today.
Yeah, and that's my thing is you want grist for the mill. You want material to build from and tell stories about. And I realized when they did the reboot that there was a lot of barnacles, and it was probably overwhelming. It was probably a lot like the X-Men stuff where it was almost impenetrable to some people. And those miniseries were very valuable in trying to encapsulate that material. And I wish I'd gotten exposed to those materials when I was a kid, and I might have been able to invest earlier and more fully in the Superman comic books than I did. But yeah, if he comes from Krypton and he's an Earthling, then you have a conflict because, well, he can't go back to Krypton. Krypton's gone forever, but because of the influence of Krypton, he can never be entirely satisfied with life on Earth because he knows there's another way, there's another kind of people, another way of thinking. And so again, that's where drama comes from. That's where conflict comes from. That's where you give Superman pathos. Yeah, he can push planets around and such, but again, it's like from the first Superman movie. I can do all these incredible things, but I couldn't save my dad, and he couldn't save his other parents, and he couldn't save the world in which he was born. I feel like he has to have at least some time on Krypton or some memory of Krypton, because that's where you find his vulnerability, where no, he's not just from Earth. He's from this other place, this fantastical place that he will never walk on again. And no matter how many little time travel things that he does, especially back in the Silver Age, he did quite a lot of that, but he's never able to, it's a fixed point in continuity or whatever they called it in Spider-Verse. He can never fix that one mistake that dooms his people, and that enriches the character, I feel.
Yeah, you're spot on with that. And that reminds me, I'll just mention briefly, and I don't remember the year that it came out, but I remember someone on some podcast saying that they thought this was the worst Superman story that they'd ever read. I loved it. I think it was called The Return of Jonathan Kent. And Jonathan Kent shows up at the Daily Planet one day in like the late 1970s, and everybody accepts him, and he never died. And Clark is, what's going on here? This isn't right. And then it turns out that Jonathan Kent, way back when, was given like one last wish to come and see his son after his death. You need all that stuff for those stories. You need something to root them in. That's what those Krypton stories did.
We were just talking about the Silver Age origin of Krypto. Good time to talk about the character more fully. Krypto the Superdog marks his territory as the midpoint of our coverage. Created by Otto Bender and Curt Swan for a one-off story in 1955's Adventure Comics number 210, Superboy's superpowered pet proved so popular that he appeared in hundreds of comics, mostly in the Silver and Bronze Ages. Krypto was more or less killed off in the 1986 imaginary story Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow by Alan Moore, Curt Swan, George Perez, and Kurt Schaffenberger. In the final pre-crisis Superman tale, Krypto gives his life to save his master from the threat of the Kryptonite Man, dying from radiation exposure. But don't worry, he eventually came back into modern comics, though he's mostly been the pet of everybody but Superman. Included are the Connor Kent and John Kent Superboys, but most especially Supergirl. Krypto also had his own 2006 Johnny DC Kids Line comic that ran 6 issues as a TV tie-in. Because of his fantastic nature, Krypto had to wait for animation to make the leap to mass media. Although not officially Krypto, there was an unaired 1958 pilot made for The Adventures of Super Pup, a live-action spectacle involving little people in giant, expressionless animal mascot masks. Another ill-fated attempt to salvage the popular Adventures of Superman series after the George Reeves tragedy. Instead, Krypto hit television on the 1966 Adventures of Superboy cartoon series, 39 episodes of his own cartoon in 2006 voiced by Sam Vincent, multitudinous other animated appearances, and starred in the 2022 CGI film DC League of Super Pets, voiced by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Obviously, Krypto's biggest splash to date was in James Gunn's 2025 Superman film. Our reference for this entry comes from Superman Secret Files 2009, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Francis Manapul. It features Connor Kent, bent down on one knee in farm clothes, petting the contentedly panting Krypto, who is in profile. And this is another one where I really do like the artwork. There's not a lot going on here. It's just a plain white background, but boy and his dog, what's not to love there? And it's a great representation of Krypto, I feel.
Oh, yeah. And like you were saying a minute ago, John Byrne, and I was probably on board with this in the late 80s, where Krypto was one of those barnacles that needed to be scraped off. And, this is getting a little silly here, but it's interesting. All that stuff came back. They got rid of Supergirl. They got rid of the Legion. They got rid of Krypto, and everything comes back. I know a bunch of people who have seen the new film. Krypto really was one of the things that brought them to it. And they don't explain why is this dog wearing a cape. You just have to go with it. Like, that's the charm of Superman and like this era of comics. Maybe in the 80s and 90s, they was out of favor, but these things are cyclical. Now it's time to bring some of these things back. And I really like Krypto. And I didn't realize until I was doing a little research getting ready for tonight just how many stories he was in Superboy and in the Superman proper stories in the 50s and 60s. He was all over the place.
As a kid, I was very conscious of Krypto. And part of it was that they were running the Adventures of Superboy cartoon that ran from 66 to 68 in syndication that time period. And so I got a lot of Krypto there, and I really enjoyed it. By the way, I will say, too, I do think Curt Swan is the best Krypto artist, and whatever breed of dog that is still my Krypto.
That's right. The current Krypto is a little too scruffy, but for me, but I'll take him. I'll take him anyway.
It may be one of those situations where every generation has to have their own Krypto. It's really about a super dog, less about what breed of dog, but I'm still going to favor the Curt Swan breed.
Yes. And, when you're a little kid, what could be better than having a super dog that's flying around and, has a cape and is your pal? No, it's great. It's very, very charming.
Well, and you had that period with the New 52 where everything had to be stupid, ludicrously extreme, where they had this gigantic wolfhound Krypto with giant fangs and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, I think that it's more impactful the smaller the dog is when they do the incredible things that Krypto does.
Right. I think you're 100% right.
I do have a controversial statement, though, in part because I know Krypto from the Superboy cartoons, and I've acknowledged the value of Superboy within the lore. I do feel like Krypto is supposed to be Superboy's pet. And that doesn't mean that you have to euthanize a dog as soon as Superman turns 18 or something, but it is weird for me when you have the dog with him as an adult. And it's not like, obviously adults have pets. It's not about that. It's about you have to constantly take things away from Superman because he's so incredibly powerful. You have to show that vulnerability. You have to show that even he loses things. And I feel like Superboy has to have Krypto. Boy has to have his dog. But I think that when Superman has it, it's a little too greedy. And I think that it's better to take Krypto away from him for whatever reason. I know that there was still a Krypto around into the early 80s, and he was just off playing in the universe, very similar to what they did do in the movie, where it's like Krypto's maybe a little too much to have on Earth. Let's just let him go off into space and do crazy stuff. I don't love seeing the super dog in the Superman adventures. I believe that he belongs with Superboy.
No, I think you're 100% right. And even in this Action 500, Krypto's off in outer space doing his thing. He really is not seen all that much here and there. I'd say by the time you get to the early 70s and into the 80s, he's very much occasional. But it's nice to know that he didn't die, that he's out there roaming around somewhere.
On a farm somewhere.
Right.
We can't visit him, but he's on the farm and he's having a great time.
Yeah.
Boys and girls, your attention, please. The Blank Corporation presents a brand new radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an amazing and incredible personality. Faster than an airplane, more powerful than a locomotive, impervious to bullets. Up in the sky, look!
It's a giant bird!
It's an airplane! It's Superman! Superman, a being no larger than an ordinary man, but possessed of powers and abilities never before realized on Earth. Able to leap into the air an eighth of a mile at a single bound, hurdle a 20-story building with ease, race a high-powered bullet to its target, lift tremendous weights, and rend solid steel in his bare hands as though it were paper. Superman, strange visitor from a distant planet, champion of the oppressed, physical marvel extraordinary who has sworn to devote his existence on Earth to helping those in need. But before we bring you the almost unbelievable story of how Superman arrived on Earth, a message from the Blank Corporation, makers of Blanco, that extra-rich, full-flavored breakfast food with a new taste thrill.
Coming soon to the Fire and Water Podcast Network.
It's Superman Movie Minute. Chris Franklin and Rob Kelly take you on a journey through time and space, examining 5 minutes at a time the greatest superhero movie of all time, 1978's Superman.
Coming soon to a podcast network near you.
You'll believe 5 minutes can fly.
Swell.
Now for the story of Superman. And as it begins, we ask you to come with us on a far journey. A journey that takes us millions of miles from Earth.
Since we were just talking about the Man of Steel, it's probably a good time to offer a related entry. Now, I generally cut off the reference materials at 2011, at the start of the New 52. However, Chuck brought up the Phantom Stranger as a topic, and I stumbled upon a card set that mostly covered the pre-Flashpoint continuity. So we'll be looking at the 2013 Cryptozoic DC Comics Superman the Legend, card number 52. Unfortunately, there are no art credits available, but the image appears to be shattered glass
with fragments depicting General Zod, Mon-El, Chris Kent, and others. The Phantom Zone was created by Robert Bernstein and George Papp for 1961's Adventure Comics number 283. Card text reads, infamous as the place where Kryptonians banish their criminals, the Phantom Zone is an interdimensional prison whose inhabitants are rendered insubstantial as ghosts. Return from the zone is rare and difficult, and cannot be accomplished from within the zone itself. We're not necessarily getting the big names on these cards. What do you think of the artwork as presented, though?
This is serviceable. It captures the time and the shattered glass right out of the 1978 movie. I was always a sucker for the Phantom Zone, that there were these superpowered villains who occasionally got out, but they always got put back. And so you didn't have to worry about them forever. I should have looked up the year, but in the early 1980s, Gene Colan did a Phantom Zone miniseries. I forget the name of the writer.
I think it was Steve Gerber, wasn't it?
Yes, that was great. I poured over that thing because I had never seen artwork like that. It was my first Gene Colan, and some of the villains were really scary. Again, they built on some of those old Phantom Zone stories from the 60s. And I guess my first real introduction was in the 1978 movie. Terrence Stamp was really pretty scaring in that opening sequence of the film.
Yeah, again, having just rewatched the 3-hour cut of that thing, it's just amazing to me watching that sequence with Zod and the Phantom Zone criminals, because again, they only could do so much in that time period. So much of it is just projecting people's faces against a black backdrop, extreme close-ups of eyes and of mouths, and you've got the silly little hula hoop things going, but the performances are so strong and so striking that it just completely sells what's happening. And again, you watch the dome opening up and the light shooting up into the sky, and yeah, it's goofy when they do the little spinning thing and then all of a sudden they're into the glass pane that's flying through space, but you feel what they're feeling. You know that these guys, this is so much worse than a regular prison because all they're going to do is just be encased and watch the world go by and not being able to affect anything, not even being able to stay in one place long enough to really absorb what they're seeing. It's so nightmarish. And yet also these people survived when the rest of Krypton perished. So you have that weird dichotomy. And then, of course, in the miniseries you talk about, we see that it's actually is a dimension there, but it's like essentially hell. You know, it's all these creatures and all this, nothing's stable and everything's out to destroy you. And I don't know what's worse, being in a place where you're constantly imperiled, or you will never be able to find safe haven, or to be in its ghostly form where all you do is watch things and not be able to have any impact and not be acknowledged and not see anybody else in the Phantom Zone. Seeming like someone with Mon-El, I don't think that he was interacting with anybody, at least in the earlier version of the Phantom Zone. So either way, it's an incredible pop culture concept. It's a metaphysical concept that isn't necessarily represented anywhere else in mythology, to my reckoning, or at least it's a flavor that's unique. And of course, that's another one of these things that really got lost post-crisis. They started dipping back into that in relatively recent years. Obviously, Jeff Johns getting Dick Donner to actually write Superman material that reflects what he did in the movies. We see a lot more of the Phantom Zone, especially in the late 2000s. And it's such a Superman-specific concept. I don't know that the art well represents that because, again, it's just showing you the shattered mirror. I don't think it necessarily tells you what the Phantom Zone is. But, yeah, I love the concept. And, yeah, incredible comic book lore.
General Zod was not one of the main villains really up until the film. There were other Jax-Ur and some other ones. And I always wished, and it must have been a legal reason, but if they had just started to include those movie Kryptonians into the comics in the early 80s, instead of waiting 25 years, that would have been great. But today, everything is all synergy and put together. But back then, they must not have had the rights to use Ursa and Nan. But I'm glad they finally included them all those years later.
Well, and Ursa was more or less Feora, right?
Right.
And now we have two of them, so that works too.
Yes, that's right.
But yeah, I do like the idea of these. It's another one of those things where you can't have them running around. They're extremely powerful. They're Kryptonians, so obviously they can't just be loose in the universe. So you have this thing where they can get loose for a while, they can cause a bunch of problems, and then Superman can put them back where they belong, and then you're ready to reset for the next gameplay.
Yes, yes. It was sort of like Candor. I always liked those stories where, okay, now we're going to go to this little miniaturized city in a bottle, and he would have some adventures, and then he would leave. And so when he's supposed to be trying to find a way to enlarge them, he never did for many, many years. It was a nice little avenue. You could go down that street and deal with those characters and stories once or twice a year, and that was enough.
Well, again, we were talking about those lost Jimmy Olsen stories. And it's like, yeah, every now and again, a T-Power Superman and Jimmy Olsen are going to be Batman and Robin in this tiny little city. Okay, I'm with you. Let's go. Let's have fun with this.
I wonder how many people reading comic books today, like, even know where the name Nightwing comes from. Clark was Nightwing, right? And Jimmy was Flamebird, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds
but that's
right.
where the name Nightwing comes from. It's from those Candor stories.
And explicitly in the Nightwing origin story, at the origin of the identity in Tales of the New Teen Titans, he says, yes, I wanted to honor both the influence of Batman and of Superman by
that's right.
this Kryptonian mythological being. So yeah.
It all comes back.
Okay, so the life story of Superman continues into Chapter 2, A Legend is Born. In a markedly different take from the black and white media origin of Superman, the Kryptonian rocket is made invulnerable by Earth's yellow sun, landing without a scratch. It was only the ignition of the yellow solar-infused super fuel that was strong enough to damage the rocket. The elderly married couple, the Kents, followed the rocket to its landing and are established as Jonathan and Martha, not Eben and Sarah like the serials and TV series. They anonymously drop the child they found at an orphanage, then swiftly return to seek an adoption. While not the case here, in some version of the story, the immediately superhuman Kal-El made a lot of trouble at the orphanage, making them eager to adopt the problem child out. In one telling, the super baby used his heat vision to cause a hanging sign to bonk a supervisor on the head on his way home with the Kents. Regardless, the rechristened Clark Kent demonstrated formative versions of Superman's powers on the Kent farm, causing or proving his salvation from various troubles. The Kents eventually realized that the swaddling clothes and blankets sent with Kal-El were invulnerable, and with the help of his heat vision, able to sew together outfits that don't burn off whenever Clark moves at super speed or smothers a flame. In his adolescence, Clark decided that it was time to use his powers for a greater good than the Kent farm, and used those same materials to forge his first Superboy costume. Between training with his pa and trial and error, Kal-El developed both the nerdy Clark Kent and Superboy personas for his daily life. It's eventually discovered that the rocket had dragged countless items from Krypton in its wake, causing a variety of remnants to reach Earth over time. Most concerning was a vast variety of radioactive rocks that had different effects on Kryptonian life forms, with basic green kryptonite causing Clark illness and eventual death with enough exposure. Another artifact that was eventually recovered was a Phantom Zone projector, as we discussed. Krypto's rocket eventually found its way planet-side, reuniting Kal-El and his doggy. The arrival was especially important to Superboy because while he loved and respected his adopted parents and world, his long memory and lifetime of fantastic abilities had separated him from ordinary men. It took a super dog to fly freely alongside a Superboy, alleviating some of the loneliness of a people long lost. While Lana Lang is dismissive of Superman's getting all misty over a dog, Lois Lane understood what Krypto represented and how these were the happiest days of Superman's life. There's a whole side about the Kents eventually finding a fountain of youth that at first reverses their ages, which feels like a continuity patch to stories most people have never read at this point.
Right.
The Kents re-aged, and then following a Caribbean family vacation, they succumbed to a rare infection and died. In this case, Pa outlived Ma by a short period. The heartbroken Kal-El moved to the big city, getting a spectacular send-off of Superboy, while Clark Kent boarded a nighttime bus alone. Privately rattled, Superman was prodded to move to the Metropolis exhibit. Where are we at on this chapter?
Oh, like you said, that whole thing about de-aging them and aging them back. And I know that the Kents had to die in this era of the story, but I do like that the Kents are out there. I loved it when John Byrne brought them back and then somebody got rid of them again and now they're back again. But I think they ground the character. That scene in the film with Clark and Pa Kent on the porch, that was one of the best scenes in the movie as far as I was concerned. And it echoes a little bit of what Glenn Ford was doing. That reminds me real quick, I wanted to mention about that 1978 movie. That movie was such an epic. You have these big name movie stars, Glenn Ford, and he's in the movie, can't be in it 5 minutes, but he gets to the essence of Pa Kent there. And I think the Kents are important. That's the whole point of this current movie. They're the ones who make him the hero, not where you came from.
I mean, it's basically two scenes. It's when they find the baby and when a teenage Clark comes back from the football game. But
Right.
he gives the speech, and that's one of the most important things that happens in the entire movie, because that's again, and you mentioned the same with the new movie. That's the Earthling part of Superman. That's what are you here for? Why are you here? It's not just because Space Daddy told you that you had to go away from the planet that blew up. Well, once you get to that planet, who are you supposed to be? What are you supposed to be doing? And Jonathan is always the guy who tells him that, at least in modern era.
Right.
I don't know how much of that came from the Silver Age. I don't know. I feel like maybe some of that came from the movie, because I've always felt that like there was an awful lot of Peter Parker in the first movie's Superman. And but because that's such a huge influence on me and my interpretation of Superman, I can't let that go. So of course, Pa Kent lives large in my mind, giving the with great power comes great responsibility speech to Superman in his own words, more specific to the Man of Steel.
Right. And the 1960s and 70s Superboy stories are charming, but they get a little too squeaky clean. He is such a Boy Scout, and they are so perfect. And you wish that he would rebel a little bit against Ma and Pa. I understand what they were doing, but I think starting here, going forward, the Kents have been used much, much better. And look, they were on the TV show for all that, on Smallville for all those years.
Yeah, I have to admit that clearly going back to Lois and Clark, which I think the first time you spent a lot of time with them in media. Yeah, it made sense that he had somebody to bounce off of and to continue giving him paternal advice. And so I respect that. I've still, again, though, bloodthirsty me, I've still got to kill the Kents when you have a Superman. Kents are for Superboy, not for Superman. So for me, it's another one of those deals where you have to have that speech where, for all my powers, for all my abilities, I couldn't save him. That's another tragedy that Superboy needs to become Superman. So I'm not a fan. I'm a fan of those characters. I like what they do with them in the modern era. I just wish all that were concentrated in the Superboy part. I don't want them to be part of the Superman part, because I want that sadness and I want that tragedy. Because again, if you give him everything, if all he has to do when he has a problem is fly off to the Kent farm and have some apple pie and listen to Ma give him advice, then what do you need a Fortress of Solitude for? What do you need?
That's true.
When does he step up and become the hero, when everybody's just like, he's got this incredible support system. Everybody's alive. Nobody's dead. And he doesn't have anybody to miss, because the only people that are gone are people that he didn't have anything to do with, especially in the modern era, never cared about. Where's the drama?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it reminds me, just very briefly, this Superman book that I mentioned, getting everybody to sign. A few years back, I was at one of these Comic-Cons, and John Schneider was there from Smallville. And there was a young couple in their, let's say, late 20s who had just gotten married like the day before. And that was part of their honeymoon, was to go meet him and sit in the General Lee and talk about Superman and Smallville. And he could not have been nicer to them. And one of the things that he said to them, I'm standing there waiting to get my book signed. And he said something along the lines of that for 20, 25 years, whenever he walked outside, went to an airport, somebody's saying, hey, the Duke's a hazard. And the day after Smallville aired, somebody called him Jonathan Kent. And like, that shows you the power of Superman. It could wipe away, all that other stuff for decades. And now because Superman is so central, but I like to have the Kents alive, but it probably, storytelling wise, it's probably better that they do get left behind when he leaves Smallville.
And I also love the thing, and they've been doing this for almost as long as there's been Superman media. I love when characters age into different characters. I love that Noel Neill becomes the parent of Lois Lane. I love that Annette O'Toole is Ma Kent. I love that you have this legacy among Superman materials where, you had a role at this point in your life, but there's still a place for you at this later point in your life. So I really do dig that. And I like to, it's got, again, like you said, you've got the Duke boys, and I'm sure it's great to have at least that one thing that everybody knows you for. But if you have a second thing with a second group of people who may be a different kind of people, and you get a little of this flavor of fan over here, this little fan over here, that's got to be nice. That's got to be a great way to be. You want to have a bunch of characters with a bunch of different people loving those characters in different ways,
Yes.
Now, here's the other thing, Kryptonite. How do we feel about the Skittles Kryptonites?
Well, it did become a crutch. It really did. And, I understand why they had to get rid of it in the Bronze Age where it all turns to iron. But it's such a great plot device. that they can't leave it alone. And again, it's another one of those things when people talk about a politician or an athlete and what's their weakness, they say that's their kryptonite, and they don't even reference Superman. It's just become so much a part of the culture. And again, as a kid reading those stories, I loved, that there was blue kryptonite and red kryptonite and so forth, but they have tended to lean on it. Look, they're still using it in the movie now. That's the thing that Metamorpho's there for, but it's just part of the culture. It's become part of the lore, and you can't not have it, I guess.
When you've got somebody as powerful as Superman, you need an off switch. You need to be able to create a situation where he's not the most powerfulest person who can solve every problem with the wide range of powers he has. I do agree, though, that as a kid, there were so many kryptonites, and for me, I felt it was goofy. Now, as an adult, I feel like you said, it's lore. It's part of the mythology, and so it's a lot easier for me to take now than it was when I was a kid. But I like, okay, well, what is this kryptonite doing? What does this kryptonite do? I kind of dig that now, more so than I did when I was growing up.
Right. There was like blue kryptonite that was only for Bizarro, and there was gold kryptonite, I think, that stripped their powers. And it's a plot device, but what are you going to do?
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. Kellogg's Pep. P-E-P, Pep. Kellogg's Pep, the Sunshine Cereal, presents The Adventures of Superman. Today, Clark Kent and his friends Batman and Robin are shocked by a startling revelation that leads to an incredible mystery.
Superman Radio Revisited, hosted by Matthew T. Cody. This is going to be a new podcast which will be exploring the Superman radio show of the 1940s. It will begin by playing an episode, unfiltered, unedited, uncensored, uncut, followed by my commentary. We're going to talk about the era a little bit and any interesting things that crop up in the episodes. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I'm hoping to make it an interactive show. So come along. It's going to be a great time.
Hello there, gang. This is your pal Dan McCullough. You know, those comic buttons you're all collecting in the new series from packages of Kellogg's Pep sure do make a hit when you wear them pinned on your jacket or your dresser cap. They show up so clear and bright that, well, folks take a second look. And no wonder the pictures of your favorite comic strip characters are true to life. They're straight from the funny papers. You know Vitamin Flintheart by his fuzzy fur coat and that slouch hat, and Brenda Starr by her long, wavy red hair. And Superman by his red insignia and cape flying in the wind. And all the others in this new series have 18 different buttons. Boy, is it fun to work on your collection of pet comic buttons and to trade duplicates with your friends. Now, you won't want to miss out, so get busy, gang. Ask Mom to get you a package or two of that Sunshine cereal, Kellogg's Pep. That's right. You don't have to send in any money, not even a box top. And you can't buy these prizes anywhere. You just look for your new comic button in every package of Kellogg's Pep you open. And see how Pep brightens up your breakfast, too. Those golden toasted flakes of real whole wheat are so crisp and so fresh and so full up with catchy sunshine flavor that, well, your every spoonful calls you right back for more. So ask Mom to get plenty of P-E-P, the Sunshine Cereal, Kellogg's Pep. And now the adventures of Superman.
So we spent a lot of time with Superman. We gave you a bit of a break at the front end. Let's give you a little bit of a break at the back end. We're also transitioning out of the Golden Age into the Silver Age. So I'd like to look at some characters from that time period, one of which would be the Phantom Stranger, taken from the January 2004 cover dated JLA-Z number 3. This entry was written by Mike McAvennie and drawn by Chris Jones and Mick Gray. It depicts a stranger standing in front of a towering building on a nighttime city street
extending his hand toward the viewer. The Phantom Stranger was created by John Broome and Carmine Infantino for his own short-lived eponymous series in 1952. It seems like nowadays, that would be considered the golden age. But I'm old enough to remember that there used to be a gap from about 1948 until the superhero revival in 1956. By that measure, the 6 issues of The Phantom Stranger would have landed in that gray period when horror, crime, romance, war, sci-fi, and westerns dominated the stands. The Phantom Stranger's origins are in dispute by his very nature, with some naming him an angel or otherwise ancient immortal figure, while others frame him as a time traveler. No one knows the stranger's name or origin, or even how to contact him. Yet in times of crisis, whether moral or magical, the supernatural nomad appears to help. His mystical energies are inexplicably tied into the collective strength of humankind, though he himself often seems one step removed from humanity, even after lending aid to his allies, such as those in the JLA. Instead, he vanishes as mysteriously as he appeared, choosing to remain a stranger. How do we feel about this artwork?
I wish Jim Aparo had done it, but it captures the essence of the character. That's the classic look. He's just this mysterious figure, and that's how I like him. I don't want to know his origin. I like him that he just comes and goes as needed. But again, this is just one of those characters that, for some reason, I don't know, I never read all that many stories of him. I did recently buy the omnibus with his stories in them. I just like the Phantom Stranger. I don't know why. He could be the host of a Netflix show or something with the DC characters running around.
Looking at the artwork, I really like the building. Modern artists don't really take the time to draw stuff like buildings like that anymore. It's a nice perspective. I don't know what the building has to do with the Phantom Stranger, though, is the tricky part. It looks nice, but what are you telling me with this image? I do like the slightly menacing take on the character. I like how simplified and stripped down it is. It's almost like an animated version. A lot of these images actually took are like the animated versions, even when it's not necessarily the intention. So I do like that. I also kind of like Phantom Stranger's fashion choices. We joke a lot about what character you could cosplay as. I could see doing the Phantom Stranger too. I think that's pretty doable. I think I could rock a white turtleneck okay. Maybe with a girdle or something. That'd be something you could pull off. So I kind of dig that about him.
Yeah, and you never saw his face. I mean, full, straight on. In the original stories in the 50s, where it was a different sort of take on the character, you did. I just liked him that, like, he was this all-powerful, all-knowing character who was there and then gone. I knew him mostly through those Brave and the Bold stories with Jim Aparo. And he pops up on the Brave and the Bold cartoon in one of the best episodes where they do Batman Origin, where he goes back in time and helps Batman deal with his origin again. But that was really, really well done.
Yeah, I don't know how great the Phantom Stranger is as a protagonist, as the lead in a series, but he's an excellent Deus Ex Machina. He's an excellent exposition machine. If you've got a problem with a story, Phantom Stranger's got a solution for you. Don't even sweat it.
That's perfect.
And like you, my exposure to the character goes back to Brave and the Bold, specifically 1978's issue 145 by Bob Haney and Jim Aparo. It's a primordial comic. I don't remember buying it off the newsstand, but it was always in my comic book collection. That's one of the earliest comics I had in my possession. And so seeing Aparo do the Phantom Stranger, that's just made my blood. Can't help that. And then also, I do remember when I believe it was 1982 Song of the Swamp Thing series started. I did buy that off the newsstand at 7-Eleven, at least the first couple of issues. Mike W. Barr did a story in issue number 2. It was a backup feature. I think Don Spiegel was doing the artwork on those. And so that definitely told me who the Phantom Stranger was. He's this mysterious dude who shows up under somewhat occult or at least some sort of menacing circumstance and tries to help people out. And that's all you really need to know about the guy. I like his look. I've not read a ton of like super great, like, oh my God, all the Phantom Stranger stories, but I tend to enjoy when he shows up in a story that I'm already reading.
The ones that I have read, if I remember correctly, that that in the omnibus, they're mostly like kind of one and dones, where he meets someone. They're almost like Twilight Zone kind of stories, and he's a mystical Rod Serling who will come in. I like your take on the character.
You dropped a Rod Serling reference. That's perfect. That's excellent. Oh. Doesn't matter if it's Twilight Zone or Night Gallery. That's who this Phantom Stranger is. Next up, we've got the Elongated Man, which is another one of these guys who was at the vanguard of the DC Silver Age. From here, we move to the first issue of JLA-Z, cover dated November 2003 for the Elongated Man entry. It's written by Mike McAvennie, drawn by Scott Daniel and Rob Stull. We see Ralph stretching up to the skyline of a major city, his bride Sue wrapped securely to his chest by layers of his arms.
Elongated Man was created by John Broome and Carmine Infantino for 1960's The Flash number 112 because they wanted to use a Plastic Man type character, but didn't realize DC had already bought Plastic Man himself. From the entry, by drinking a secret gin gold extract, Ralph Dibny becomes the super stretchable sleuth known as the Elongated Man. It's no stretch to say that his extensive elasticity, plus a keen analytical ability second only to Batman's, made him a valuable member of the original Justice League of America and Justice League Europe. He and his wife Sue prefer to broaden their horizons and travel the world, stopping only whenever Elongated Man's prehensile proboscis twitches at the scent of a good mystery. How do we feel about this artwork?
I like it because Ralph and Sue were a team. I specifically remember the first story with them that I read. There was one of those DC Secret Origin digests, and they had how he drank the gin gold and became stretchable sleuth and all that. But to me, they were always kind of like Nick and Nora Charles, these lighthearted investigators. I always prefer to see him in the JLA stories rather than Plastic Man. I think he works better there. He's a character that I've just always liked. Can he support a series? Probably not. But they used him to pretty good effect on the Flash TV show for a couple of seasons. He's got the same powers as Mr. Fantastic. But I think that the married couple aspect was the most fun part of it. And I'm not going to talk about Identity Crisis because that didn't happen. So
I've heard the Nick and Nora Charles thing before. I definitely see Nora Charles. I think Ralph comes up a little short as Nick, you know?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I feel like he's a little bit more like... I'm trying to think of somebody who's appropriate. He tries to be funny. I don't ever find him to be funny. So I love Sue Dibny. I kind of struggle with Ralph Dibny a little bit. I actually, weirdly enough, I kind of liked him in 52 when he's mourning her and singing to be an alcoholic while secretly actually swilling gin gold. I agree with you. I like him in the Justice League. I don't like Plastic Man in the Justice League at all. He's not well served in the DC universe. He's especially not well served as a Justice League member. That's Ralph's spot. They have an elongated person already. They don't need a Plastic Man. So I do respect him in that regard. I like him when they play him as a detective, which doesn't happen enough because he is quite a good detective. He's arguably one of the best detectives in the DC universe, and his stories were always around being a detective. The stretching was sort of the side hustle. It's about them solving these murder mysteries or mysteries in general, and when they're playing that up, and the more we get to lean on Sue, the more I like it.
One of my all-time favorite miniseries of the last maybe 10, 20 years was that one with Alex Ross called Justice. There's a sequence where all the heroes, for some reason, have to go and meet at the Fortress of Solitude. And Ralph speaks up and says, why didn't you call me? Why did you call Plastic Man? I'm the team player, not that kind of Looney Tune. And thought that was sort of a nice nod that he's kind of gotten pushed to the side as Plastic Man has become in the Justice League and on a lot more of the merchandise and things.
And the thing about that, too, is I don't think the fans really embraced Plastic Man in that role either. Like, they keep foisting him because he was on a cartoon, because he was such a big seller back in the 40s. But I don't know that most Justice League people really ever embraced him. I think most people just prefer, if we're going to go that route, let's go ahead and get Ralph in the scene. So, yeah.
Do you think it might be the name? Elongated Man is kind of silly. If you're a kid and you read it, you buy it. But try to explain that to someone, like Mr. Fantastic or Elastikid or whatever, Elastilad. Elongated Man, it just doesn't trip off the tongue. But now I'm looking back on it, I'll accept it.
Yeah, I really don't think the name matters. I think it's the power set. I think that most modern audiences just don't like stretchable heroes. They associate it with goofy cartoon stuff. I think there's also that element of the self-serious comics fanboy who doesn't like whimsical stuff in the mix. It's very difficult to do stretching without it being whimsical. And you look at somebody like probably the most successful is Mr. Fantastic. And the first thing everybody brings up about him is the super intelligence. The stretching, especially in modern years, is like 5, 6. He's a husband. He's a brother. He's a best friend. He's a great enemy. Anything but talking about the dude stretching.
Well, you're right, because someone actually mentioned that to me, that in the new movie, he doesn't stretch that much. He does, but you're right. It's more about the intelligence than anything else.
Yeah, and I didn't have problem with the stretching in the movie, but I've heard from people who do. And I think it's just something inherent in the stretching. You think of fruit roll-up commercials. You don't think of superheroes. And as far as the art goes, I've always struggled with Scott McDaniel. I like elements of it. I like some of the deep shadows and some of the musculature, but I just struggle with his stuff. And so it doesn't really do a lot for me. The concept is fine. He's not my guy, though.
Yeah, it's specific to this time period.
And do you happen to recall when you were first exposed to him?
again, in the early 80s, they were doing those DC digests, and they had a couple of secret origin ones where it was just kind of random heroes, Elongated Man and Zatanna and maybe Robin or whatever. And I remember that one. But I never read a whole hell of a lot of his backup stories until later. And again, not that many.
And for me, growing up in Houston, what I found is that on the newsstand, DC did not have great representation. They just were not heavily distributed in our area. Texas, historically, especially in that time period, very much favored Marvel. And so a lot of my DC exposure came from media. It came from cartoons and such. And Plastic Man had a cartoon, and this guy didn't. And specifically, a friend of mine had the comic book Justice League of America 217. It had a George Perez cover, very iconic. They used it on like school notebooks and folders and stuff. And for me, that was like a gateway into a whole new universe. There were so many characters that were DC that I probably saw for the first time rendered by George Perez, which is the way you want to do that.
Yes.
And so I definitely saw that guy on that cover. And so it's, oh, hey, there's a stretching guy. I don't know that I necessarily knew who he was. I didn't read the book. I'm sure the art on the inside was nowhere near as good as the art on the outside. And so what I had to wait for is there was a house ad for Wonder Woman number 308, which was Black Canary and Elongated Man, probably my first exposure to Black Canary as well. But in terms of comic books, I picked up Blue Devil 4-5 at a flea market. And I thought that Paris Cullins was particularly good at drawing the character, and seeing him again in the Justice League satellite context, that's part of what makes him belong there. And of course, I've gone back and I've read the Detroit stuff, and then, that era. I'm well familiar with the Elongated Man. I've had plenty of opportunities to embrace him. I like him okay. He's not one of my favorites or anything, but I do like the guy, and I do believe that he belongs amongst the JLA.
Yeah.
And then the final question, are you a red and blue guy or a purple guy?
If I close my eyes, I think I see him in red because that's what he was wearing when I read most of his early stories. But I could go either way. I'm fine with the purple too. What about you?
I think that if you're going to have him be the star of a series, you go with the red and blue because that's the most iconic superhero colors. And of course, he stands out the most as a Justice League member. But given his relative stature, he probably should just be in the purple and white. I don't think he really rates. You got to be up there to be a red and blue guy. I don't think he quite rates that the color scheme. The life story of Superman concludes in chapter 3, Call Me Superman, but it's so long that we'll break it up in two. At 18, Superboy becomes Superman, while Clark Kent spends 4 years attending Metropolis University. It's there that he can really hone his bumbling nerd Clark identity, but it also made it hard to get Perry White to take him seriously as a potential hire. Clark outmaneuvering star reporter Lois Lane on a Superman story showed Kent's potential, but also made a longtime adversary of the Scoop veteran love interest. Having built up quite a super inventory of robot doubles and alien artifacts that couldn't be left unattended on the Kent farm, Superman built the Fortress of Solitude to store all his super stuff behind a giant key lock that only he could turn. Thanks to his rocket's wake, the domed city of Argo temporarily survived the destruction of Krypton with just enough resources to eventually rocket its sole survivor to Earth. Kal-El's cousin, Kara Zor-El, would reunite with him and eventually become a public-facing Supergirl after years serving as a secret weapon. There's nods to past loves like Lana Lang and the mermaid Lori Lemaris, as well as early enemies like the Toyman, Parasite, and Lex Luthor, whose power gloves allowed him to match strength with the Man of Steel. Brainiac had collected and miniaturized the bottle city of Kandor, which Superman spent years trying to resize. He eventually restored its Kryptonian citizens, but miscalculated on the inorganic matter of the city itself, which collapsed into dust. Though resentful, the Kandorians were glad to have a new world of their choosing to build upon, which has since slipped into an unreachable dimension. It reappears intermittently like Brigadoon. A few last quick bits. All of the various types of kryptonite were on display under lead glass. The Superman robots were rendered inoperable by increasing pollution, but they could still substitute for Clark Kent, as one was doing for this presentation. Such measures were needed since Morgan Edge had purchased the Daily Planet and made Clark a more stationary anchorman on WGBS broadcast news, rather than a roving reporter. It was here that Clark was reunited with Lana Lang as co-anchor and joined by sportscaster Steve Lombard and director Josh Coyle, who seems to have been lost to time. Thoughts on this section of the story?
It does a great job of telling you where Superman was at that time. I understand why they had to move him from newspaper to a television reporter, but it just doesn't work. Clark Kent is this regular journalist, and now he's on the 6 o'clock news or the national news, and it just doesn't work. And you see why they eventually put him back in the Daily Planet. I did like that they started to include some other characters. I remember Josh Coyle, but I think he was always popping antacid or Tylenols or something or other. But he's one of those characters like totally forgotten. There was another character called, was it Dr. Dundee, who was Clark's doctor in Smallville, I think, and who used to pop up, or no, or that's, I'm getting them mixed up. That might have been Batman. But there are those characters who some stick around, like who would have thought Stephen Lombard would be in a movie? And, poor Josh is, never to be seen again.
I do like that expanded cast, but it's also one of those housekeeping sections where if you have to go through all this trouble to get rid of the Superman robots, maybe just don't have Superman robots in the lore. This is one of those areas where you can definitely feel where the barnacles were resting on the franchise.
Yes. It's interesting that the robots are back. I'm glad that they all don't look like Superman. That was always a little creepy. But they're back again. He's got a nice, heartfelt, touching scene with number 4 there, Gary.
Yeah, they definitely found a way of making that work, and I did very much enjoy that. And I do like... It just makes sense. It's sort of like we, again, talking with Captain Entropy, is you need more than Alfred to dust Wayne Manor. You need a team of robots to maintain a fortress of solitude full of alien creatures and all this other kind of stuff. So yeah, let's have robots, just maybe not the exact replicas of Superman running around.
I think the last treasury that DC did, up until very recently, was The Fortress of Solitude. And I did buy that one as a kid. And that's an entire book, just all the different levels and the intergalactic zoo and the robots and the trophy room and everything. And I just ate that thing up. I still have it somewhere. It's nice that Superman had his own version of the Batcave.
Absolutely. And honestly, frankly, I prefer the Fortress of Solitude. I just think it's cooler. It makes more sense too.
Me too.
Like it doesn't make sense for the Batcave to have a giant penny and a dinosaur. Totally makes sense for Superman to have all the stuff that he's got.
Right.
Another aspect of the character that was lost in transition. We next look at Bizarro, created by Otto Bender and George Papp for 1958's Superboy number 68. If it feels like I've mentioned Otto Bender a lot in this episode, this is the third in a series. Collect them all. Besides Superman and Batman combined taking up something like 65% of all Secret Files and Origins books ever produced, we somehow never got a Bizarro entry, probably because the concept was rendered way less interesting by John Byrne's radical revision of 1986. We're reduced to taking art and text from 1995's SkyBox DC Villains Dark Judgment trading card number 37, written by Roger Stern, with a painting by Bill Sienkiewicz. It's an extreme close-up of Bizarro's face, extra warped by an artist known for such. You really wanted to talk Bizarro, lay it on me.
I think, again, it's one of those things that people don't remember today, how popular the Bizarros were. There were lots of Bizarro backups and short stories and trips to the Bizarro world. I loved it was a cube, and there was a Bizarro Lois and a Bizarro Batman, and late in the Bronze Age, there was a Bizarro Joker who was crying all the time. He wasn't a villain. He was sort of more of a nuisance than anything else. But it was a way for the Superman stories to get really, really goofy. And maybe they went overboard a little bit, but it's amazing just how many of these things that they produced in about 10, 15, 20 years.
Bizarro is another one of those things like the multiple kryptonites where as a kid I was like, this is maybe a little too much. There's a cubed world and everybody's got a Bizarro version of themselves, and just figuring out the dialogue, what the dialogue was supposed to mean at any given moment was a struggle for me. I get why that needed to go away for at least a little while.
Even if you think about it, back in the 90s, they did an entire episode of Seinfeld structured around people talking the Bizarro world and the Bizarro Jerry. That just shows you how much a part of the culture it had become. He briefly mentions out of the Superman comics, but Bizarro was a pretty well-known character till the early 2000s anyway.
Yeah, Bizarro was definitely another prejudice I had to unlearn, because my first exposure to Bizarro was Super Friends, Challenge of the Super Friends, where basically he was a version of Superman that talked like Tarzan. And so I didn't fully embrace that concept of Bizarro, right? And I would see some of the stories in books like Superman from the 30s to the 70s, but when they did the post-crisis reboot and they turned him into sort of a tragic Frankenstein clone version of Superman, I got it. I saw where they were coming from. I dug some of the more horrific aspects of that, just like making him so pale and making like playing up the unearthliness of him, right? But as Bizarro kept popping up over and over again in the post-crisis, where it was just, here's the clone again, here's the clone again, here's the clone again, I got really tired of that version. Bizarro. And like you said, there's all this stuff from popular culture. One of the ones that really sticks with me of all the stupid things, C-Lab 2021. Do you remember C-Lab 2020?
Yeah, I do.
Did you ever watch 2021?
Occasionally. I don't remember it probably as well as you do.
So they had all those cartoons on Adult Swim, and basically what they would do is recycle animation from the original cartoon with new additions, and it was an absurdist humor type. People who watch stuff like Archer Today would be familiar with that same type of humor. And there was one particular segment that was Bizarro, and it was the Bizarro version of a C-Lab 2021 people. And the main thing that happened is you had weird versions of these characters that just kept saying, Bizarro, Bizarro, Bizarro over and over again. And I guess because of the repetition, it always stuck in my head. But just like, here's the thing you know, but weirder. And the body horror aspects of that too, kind of becoming more Cronenbergian. And it's like, okay, that was kind of a way in for me with Bizarro. But also going back and looking at not only the original Bizarro stuff, but also in the last 25 years or so, you've had specials like the Bizarro World trade paperback collection of short stories. Yes. You got people like Evan Dorkin playing around those fields. That's an area, I don't know if Keith Giffen did any Bizarro stuff, but he'd been perfect for that kind of material. Getting into that absurdity and getting into that weird, it's your world, but the opposite. And playing around with what that could potentially mean. And like you said, the Seinfeld episode, that's when I finally went, oh, okay, I get it now. Bizarro it's very much like Captain Marvel. It isn't a thing that works in a grounded, Marvelized DC universe, but it's a thing that absolutely works in the Superman sphere and a thing that works if you let it flourish and just embrace the bizarreness of it. That's when I finally understood what Bizarro represented, and that's the Bizarro I like.
I would only just quickly add that in the new movie, this Ultraman character, when he says, I cloned you, I thought when they took off the hood, it was going to be Bizarro. Somebody was going to say, oh my God, how bizarre. But they didn't. They went kind of with a long-haired David Cornsweet. But I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere along the line in that Peacemaker TV show or somewhere, that character comes back looking more like the Bizarro we all remember.
And see, this is one of those situations where I'm glad we get to have both. Let's have the kind of pale, kind of creepy clone of Superman that's defective. And then let's later on also go full Bizarro world with it. Let's have both. I'm totally contented with that.
Yeah.
And then what do you think of the artwork, though?
I think it's pretty good. It's not the classic Bizarro kind of that I think of, like chiseled out of stone. But for what it is, I think it's pretty gruesome.
It's got that weird warping to it that makes you feel like maybe it's early computer alteration or something that I'm not wild about. Yeah. But it's still a Bill Sienkiewicz. So I've seen worse for sure. But I do wish it had been a little weirder or a little bit creepier. But I like it fairly well. It's okay.
Yeah.
Another cheat. I'm just going to go ahead and quote the postcard. The Man of Steel, the last son of Krypton. He started it all, and he's still the best. I wanted a period Superman image, and 1984's Justice League of America postcard set by George Perez fit the bill. The Man of Tomorrow has his fists resting on his hips while standing on a scaled-down representation of the moon, or maybe a meteor. In the background is an Earth seemingly being violently spun backward in time. Seems kind of familiar. I think I might have seen that somewhere before. Above Kal-El's head is a blazing red sun. In the left upper and right lower corners are hand-drawn Superman symbols with vertical gray-white streaks running on either side. The balancing of elements strongly recalls a playing card aside from the central Superman figure. Did you ever encounter this postcard, and what do you think of the image?
I'm so glad that you included that image because I specifically remember that. I have it in my closet here. I remember going down to one of my first comic book stores in the early 80s, my mom taking me, I don't know if I could drive then, and buying those postcards. Tony Isabella had a comic book store in the Cleveland Arcade, which is near where the movie ends, where Clark and Lois meet again. I have those cards, and I framed them. I have a big wooden frame that most of them fit in. That is sort of the idealized Justice League for me. That George Perez, 1980s, Bronze Age, just before the crisis. Oh, I'm so glad you picked that image.
I'm glad to hear that story. That's awesome. I dig that.
Batman wasn't in the card set. It took me years to track down that damn Batman card that he finally did.
So that they sold the Batman separately for a premium.
Yes.
You got the rest of them. And I've encountered that too. I don't have any of these postcards. I wish I did. So many of these postcards are among the most iconic representations of those heroes. I'm not so sure about this one. I do feel like Perez sometimes struggled with Superman specifically in a way he didn't with most of the other heroes. But I just love so many elements of this, and it's such a Dick Donner era Superman. I love the zip tone streaks. I love the presence of the red sun. All the little elements are very, very cool. It's a really cool layout. It's just weird because Perez is so good at drawing almost everybody else. And then you look at this, it's like, yeah, but it's not Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, is it?
You're right about that. But for people my age, if George Perez was drawing it, I bought it. His work was so far ahead, or it's seemingly much more modern and contemporary than, even though I loved Curt Swan and Jim Aparo, but his work was so great. I just ate that stuff up.
Garcia Lopez is perfect for merchandising. If I'm going to read a story, I want a Perez story. And again, with 9/10 of all the heroes, I'm going to prefer Perez over Garcia Lopez. It's just for some reason, his Superman was always just something was like, even when he had that run on Action Comics in the early 90s, he just didn't quite nail Superman the way he nails almost everybody else. It's such an odd thing because he's so perfect at everybody else. This postcard set is so perfect, and I still love it. I'm not trying to diminish it. The diamond has a slight flaw in it where everything else was absolutely perfect. It's just, and I have to pick at it because I can't help myself. And I dig too that he does have the hand-drawn Superman symbols as well. It just has this sort of fanish quality to it that I dig.
Yes.
I almost feel like maybe this is something he produced a few years earlier and they recycled it, where all the other ones were like him more at his peak, and this one was just a little off flavor, but it's still great. Yeah. I still love it.
Yeah. I wish I had the foresight to have bought more than one of those card sets 40 years ago now, but if DC said that they were coming out with them today, I'd buy them all over again.
I looked on eBay because I really would like to have a set of those postcards. They are not cheap.
No, I'm glad. One time I was thinking ahead.
I don't even think I could find any complete sets. We're talking hundreds. It's up there, yeah. I'll talk a little bit about my history with Superman real quick. Again, he's a primordial. He's one of these characters that was just always there throughout my childhood. But I definitely remember seeing Superman 78 in the movie theater. It's one of the first motion pictures I remember seeing. I had a 1980s Whitman coloring book called World Without Water. I've looked at copies since then. There must have been something else, because I seem to remember there was a coloring book that had more of a Garcia Lopez or Ordway quality to it. And I've never been able to find that one, but I definitely had World Without Water too, because I remember that cover so well. But he's running around with these dog-headed aliens and stuff. It's a bizarre thing, but I definitely remember having that. And then as far as buying the comic books, the first one I remember picking up off the stand was 1982's DC Comics Presents number 55, which was an Airwave appearance. I think I bought it for the Parasite. I thought the Parasite looked really cool. I bought it for him. Did not love the story though. And then I also bought World's Finest Comics number 289 from a Jimco. That was one where I think you had a Gil Kane cover, which was great. And then you get inside and the interiors weren't so hot. And then there was these weird plant things trying to have sex before their species goes extinct, and it ends with Superman and Batman crying because they didn't, and I didn't know what to make of this. Both those stories, DC Comics Presents had some weird thing where there was a guy who's a train conductor who rode around on a toy train that flew. It just felt like DC was doing something that I was not on their wavelength, and I just didn't get it. But also, I kept picking up Superman comic books off stands when I did find it, and it was always like a great Neil Adams or Brian Boland or Garcia Lopez or even Eduardo Barreto cover, and then you get inside, and it was usually somebody like Curt Swan. I struggle with Curt Swan. I respect Curt Swan. Swan is a huge influence on specifically Jim Starlin, who's one of my absolute favorite comic book artists and one of the hugest influences on me. But there was that stiffness, particularly in that period. It felt like somebody's dad's comics and not my comics. So I always had trouble with that. And so in terms of comic books, one of the first times I bought a comic book that I actually liked with Superman, of all things, was, again, Blue Devil 3-4 from 1984 with Elongated Man with Zatanna, and something about how Paris Cullins and Gary Martin drew those characters. Those were the versions I wanted to see and didn't see enough of. That's where I was at with my Superman stuff. But I always struggled in the time period because I felt like the Superman comics just did not evolve with the times. You would get teased with guys like Adams and Garcia Lopez doing a story here and there, but then the interiors were always like Kurt Schaffenberger or Alex Saviek. Right. It was always these guys that just couldn't live up to the billing of that cover. And I always felt a little ripped off by Superman stuff, and I just wouldn't buy it. I felt like I was getting cheated with Superman in a way I didn't with Batman, in part because Batman got Jim Aparo on the inside, and I kept getting these great artists just on the outside of Superman comic books.
And how did these guys do it? People like Curt Swan and Jim Aparo and Dick Dillon, they had runs on characters' books for years. 10, 15 years mainly doing the books. And now we get a run, if people do 12 issues in a row, it's a big deal. There were these journeyman comic book guys. I don't know if people were going out and running out to buy the next Curt Swan. The artist, when I was started to recognize, it was later a little bit for me when, Jim Lee or I can't think of the name of the guy.
What's the book?
Who did Spawn?
McFarlane.
Oh, McFarlane. When they became like rock stars. But these were guys, their job was to draw Superman and they did it, or Batman. And I understand. I know there are plenty of people who feel the same way about Curt Swan. I understand.
But that said, Curt Swan, is particularly the combination of Swan and Murphy Anderson, Swanderson. Yes. I can see such a huge influence on Jim Starlin, who I love. I love Murphy Anderson when he's drawing stuff. I love it when he inks other people. I just don't feel as strongly about Swanderson as I do about Anderson on his own, for instance.
What's funny, you remind me that back in the early 2000s, I think, or late 1990s, Jerry Seinfeld did a series of commercials for American Express where he teamed up with Superman. And they walked around New York and things were saved by American Express. And he specifically requested that the animated Superman that he interacted with was the Curt Swan Superman, because that's what, he wanted to. It was Patrick Warburton did the voice. You can find those cartoons or those commercials online. But, even into the early 2000s, that still held something of a sway.
I've never been a huge Carmine Infantino guy, but when he was inked by Murphy Anderson on Batman, that just jibed. And I still see the appeal of that. I struggle a bit more with Curt Swan, I think, just because he did so many books still. He was still very prolific in the 80s. Even in the early 90s, he was still doing stuff. But it was often, he wasn't the person I wanted on the books that I was trying to read.
No, I understand.
But I have enjoyed him on some stuff. I don't want to, and I recognize the appeal. Especially, again, Curt Swan's Krypto. Curt Swan in the 50s and 60s, with his heyday, he looks incredible compared to the people that were working that time period.
Yeah.
I just feel like I look at somebody who's also working that time period, like Gil Kane, whose style evolved over time, and he was still able to meet the moment in the 80s and the 90s. I still love Gil Kane's 90s stuff. I just don't feel that way about Curt Swan, unfortunately.
No, I understand. No, I understand.
In our epilogue to the life story of Superman, we find that the version of J. Robert Arngrim that Mayor Harkness had introduced to Superman was actually a clone who was facilitating the cloning of Superman through these various memory tapping episodes and a scraping of skin tissue. The renegade scientist behind the scheme was, of course, Lex Luthor, who rapidly grew the near-perfect duplicate of Superman and replaced the real Steel Deal during a blind spot in the tour. Luthor had used the various artifacts provided to the museum to compromise the Man of Tomorrow, including the artificial red sun radiation that had weakened Superman to the point of being captured. Despite years of trying to be the man who killed Superman, Luthor had decided to instead replace him with a duplicate under his direct influence. However, it only takes moments for Lois Lane to figure out that this replacement Superman has been Lex-pilled and called shenanigans on the clone's Luthor-sympathetic talking points in the last leg of the tour. Unfortunately, the whole building is wired to blow, with the trigger being an invisible laser at the final exit point. Enraged by the clone's askew take on Luthor's origin as a former super friend who was rendered bald in a lab mishap caused by Superboy, Lois beat feet. Superman had to swiftly use his mind to escape his cage, reactivate his powers, and catch Lois before she inadvertently triggered the detonators. Having accomplished this, he next pounded on his clone until he fell through the kryptonite display, exposing him to Gold K and stripping the clone's powers forever while Superman observed from a safe distance. It was a lot to ask of anyone, but pretty much the story of Superman's life. So how do we feel about the conclusion of our tale?
It is what it is. They had to wrap it up some way, and you knew it was going to be Lex Luthor at the end. This is just a tour through Superman for the first 40 years or so. And for me, it did its job.
Like I said, I wanted to have some place to talk about pre-crisis Superman material. There were a few different things we tossed around. This is the one we settled on. And then when I saw how thick the book was and how it was full of Curt Swan artwork, I was like, have I made a terrible mistake? I had not. I freaking love this story. This is the first time I ever read it. I love this overview of Superman lore. I loved all the areas that they touched upon. I love that the presentation of such a huge amount of information in such a streamlined fashion. I love the crazy Silver Age qualities to it, but the inking on it was really good. Once I got into the headspace of this is a Curt Swan story, I really enjoyed the artwork. I enjoyed how everything was presented. This was a blast. And I'm sorry, like I never saw this tour book. I never saw any presentation of the story anywhere ever. And we really should have. This is a book, as far as I can tell, it's never been reprinted anywhere else. And it should have been. It's one of the things that frustrates me. I didn't get to see much of the Superman. And I have problems. I think one of my big problems was that Julie Schwartz came on to Batman and he immediately brought in new talent. And they scored a home run. And it was like one of the last big things that Julie did after having that streak of hits throughout the Silver Age. And then for some reason, when he took over Superman, I think part of it was, I do think the Superman had a conservative audience who didn't like big changes, who wanted to keep seeing the same creators working on the books. I don't think they'd like things like Kryptonite no more. And so I think he just sort of like, okay, well, I'm just going to be the caretaker now. And I think that's why he kept employing the same guys for years and years. He did try to reach out to other people. Starlin did some of this stuff, but I don't think that he could get the talent that he wanted. And I don't think he was confident that he could present it in a way that the people who were already fans of the material would approve of. And so basically he ran out the clock and just was a caretaker for all those years. And he didn't look to preserving Superman. He just maintained him.
Again, I specifically remember when John Byrne's Superman came. That was a great Superman, but its time is over. We're going to go forward into the 80s and the 90s now. We needed a fresh start. It did grow stale by the second half of the 80s for sure, or the first half of the 80s for sure.
But having gone back and read this, reading it as an adult, reading it with a sense of Superman having lost something going into the modern era, I loved this version of the character. I love how rich it is, how much lore there is. I loved how often Superman was so troubled. A big part of this whole story is him struggling with having to revisit all the stuff that's still tender to him all these years into his career. I liked seeing Superman rattled in that way. I loved seeing all these different villains and all these different weaknesses and all these different parts of his mythology. And one thing that's very important to me, one thing that really sticks out for me is that he wasn't just super strong with superpowers, and he was also super intelligent. He was the man of tomorrow. He actually used his brain. And it's something that bothers me because I think it's one of these things where up until the Crisis, DC was a Superman universe. And after the Crisis, it became a Batman universe. And I think that they nerfed Superman a lot to build up Batman, and especially the intelligence. I can't respect a Superman that's just some guy from a farm that's like, I'm just a simple guy and I just believe in good and all that kind of stuff. I want a Superman who has trouble going up against Lex Luthor, in part because he's one of the only people intelligent enough that can actually stimulate him and that he can see as something of a peer. I like a Superman that's a little bit removed from humanity instead of it just being like, no, I'm just the salt of the earth regular guy. I'm not even a Kryptonian at all. Why do people talk about me like I'm an alien? I'm not an alien. I'm just a farm boy. I like it when Superman's something different. I like it when he's super, and part of that should be super intelligence. And we see that here, and we see that in the stories from this time period. And I miss that take on Superman so much.
Right. One of my criticisms with comics now, especially like Batman and Superman, they're like these gods. Batman is always 10 steps ahead of everybody, and Superman doesn't have to eat, and he never gets tired. And like we saw in this movie now, he and in Smallville, I think it's better when he is human and he does doubt himself and he gets down and makes mistakes. And I think you're spot on with what you just said there.
Well, and you got to find a place to have drama. You got to find a place to tell stories. And I think it's a situation like the Superman we have now is a large part of product of the desire to have a weekly Superman comic book. And it's very hard to do giant cosmic stories where he's breaking the barriers of reality and talking to God and all this kind of crazy stuff that he was doing in the pre-Crisis era. It's hard to do that on a monthly basis, much less on a weekly basis. I think we ended up with this serialized soap opera Superman, and it's a very domestic kind of thing. And actually, it's funny, you're talking about the Phyllis Diller sitcom. A lot of the modern Superman comic books, even today, where they've been a little bit more bold than they were, say, in the Triangle era, it's still like, well, we just got to get through this week. We got to get through this week. So it's somewhere we got to reset. And we got to go back to the farm, or we got to go back to the apartment. And here's my son, John, and here's my wife, Lois, and here's my buddies at the Daily Planet, and here's Toy Man, who will give you a hassle this week, but he's not going to be that big of a deal. We're going to wait until we do an Imperiex crossover event where the cosmos is imperiled, and that's when I'm all of a sudden going to be Superman. But a lot of the times, he's just man. I miss the imagination that goes into what you have to do to create stories about a Superman. But you have to sacrifice that when you're trying to grain stuff out on a weekly basis, comics by committee.
Right.
And it's actually one of the problems I had. I liked the new Superman movie, but a lot of the guys I talk to tell me about how much it reminds me of the triangle number. Yeah, it does remind me a lot of the triangle number. And they're coming at it as like, oh my God, I'm so happy about this. And not so much for me. So,
I understand that. I like the tone of it. I think Rob Kelly mentioned, and I agree with him, that it's the most comic booky superhero movie that you might have seen. Even the Fantastic Four, it's a comic booky. I'm glad we're starting to move away a little bit from hyper realism of the Christopher Nolan stuff. The Lois and Superman show, boy, that was kind of depressing. Smallville's. But what's great about, because we're almost near the end of our time, but this is a character that's been around for nearly 90 years now, and there will be peaks and valleys. What I like about looking at these characters is like what you're doing with this series. It's an overview. Superman is not, the core elements are there, but Superman of the World War II era is different from the late 1960s, which is different from today. And there are going to be kids who aren't even born yet who are going to know who Superman is long after we're forgotten. Superman is one of those cultural touchstones. And it's interesting to see where he is in the culture as we evolve along with him.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the things, too, as much as I'm beating the drum of, this isn't my Superman, there are people who learned about Superman from Smallville. There are people who learned about Superman from the animated series. There are people who are just now getting introduced to him through this movie. And just like I was talking about with Gil Kane, you have to evolve. Superman has to evolve too. If the Superman that's being put on screen now is the one that's going to resonate with modern audiences, let them have that. Don't be the old man who's like, you're not doing the one that I want, because I'm not going to be around in 30, 40 years, whatever time I've got left. You got to have something for the kids, and Superman should always be for the kids too. You've always got to have Superman, which is one of the problems with all the Snyder stuff, is that you're taking Superman away from children, and that's the one place where you absolutely have to have Superman. If you're not creating for the children, you've lost the script.
I keep telling people that these characters, I think they do work best for kids and younger people. They weren't expecting old guys like me to be still reading Superman. What I tell myself now is I might not like the version of Superman now, and does he need to have a teenage son? But you know what? My Superman, the Superman that we've been talking about, he's still there. He's still in those books. Those are being collected, and you can still go to comic book stores and buy them. So he hasn't been replaced. There's just one version. This is my era, and you got to let people have their era too, just like you were saying.
It's Raymond Chandler. Like you said, you want that Superman, go buy the back issues. And I got to tell you, too, that is one of the things as a retailer. When I'd get my hands on pre-crisis Superman comic books when I was a retailer, I couldn't do anything with them because he didn't count anymore. But I think today people have a little bit more regard for comic book history. We have older people buying the books now, so they have a little bit more regard for it. But yeah, the kids can have My Adventures with Superman. I can't let them have that.
Yes, me too.
Boys and girls, your attention, please. Presenting a new exciting radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an amazing and incredible personality, Superman.
Hello and welcome to the Superman Super Show. My name is Steven, and I'm here to let you know what you can expect from this new podcast. It's actually pretty simple. Starting on Monday, April 18th, I'm getting together with fellow podcaster Ed Moore, and we're going to be talking about Superman comics. That's it. Well, I should explain that we're starting from the beginning, and we're taking it all one issue at a time, one episode at a time. What that means is that in episode 1, we're going to go back to April 18th, 1938 to talk about the first appearance of Superman in Action Comics number 1. In episode 2, we're going to talk about Action Comics number 2. In episode number 3, we're going to talk about Action Comics number 3, and so on, and so on, and so on. But it's not just Action Comics we're going to be reading and talking about. We're going to read every Superman comic ever in order of publication. Yeah, I know, impossible, right? I mean, we're talking about 84 years worth of Superman comics. I'm pretty sure that the two of us are going to kick the bucket before we get anywhere close to modern day Superman. But you know what? That's for future Steven and future Ed to worry about. For now, we're just having fun with these Golden Age Superman books. And I have to tell you, if you've never read Golden Age Superman, then you're in for a treat, because the Superman of 1938 is nothing like the Superman of today. But don't take my word for it. Here's just a little of what you can expect from the Superman Super Show each and every week.
It seemed very broken.
It was a bit disjointed. Good Lord, so much happens in those 13 pages.
He could jump. and it would be a little bit easier for him. No, he just runs everywhere.
It's like Forrest Gump. He was running. What is he doing? He's got this freaking woman bound and gagged, and he just like, stay here, and sticks her behind a tree.
So they're cohesing. Is that a word? I don't know. It's not the John Byrne, Jim Lee, Whilce Portacio, hyper, even JR, art. It's very loose or very open.
I think I've learned many lessons about equality and tolerance and whatnot because of comics. But sometimes you just want to see Superman take a torturer and throw him beyond the distant trees.
The Flesh Javelin Olympics with Superman in the lead.
There you go, folks. The podcast where two regular guys separated by 1,000 miles of geography try and read every Superman comic ever. Then talk about them, one issue at a time. That's the Superman Super Show. Coming to a podcatcher near you on Monday, April 18th. Don't miss it.
Superman is a copyrighted feature appearing in Action Comics magazine. For the next installment of this thrilling new radio serial, tune in again tomorrow, same time, same station. And in the meantime, here's a final word. If you enjoy hearing about Superman, don't forget that you can follow his adventures each month in the pages of that exciting comic book, Action Comics, on sale at your local newsstand. Remember, tomorrow, same time, same station, the makers of Blankarine will again bring you... Up in the sky, look! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman!
Like I said, we're running low on time, and I promised I wouldn't keep you too much past bedtime.
Oh, no, I just want to say this has been great, and please feel free to edit me out as much as you need to make me sound like I know what the hell I'm talking about, but you've made this very, very easy and fun to do.
Look, Doctor of Pop Culture, you've laid plenty of very valuable information on us. Nobody else was going to come up with a Phyllis Diller sitcom, for instance. We got our professor here to tell us some of this stuff, so I'm glad you're here for that. I do have to ask you, what were your favorite of the secret files we looked at today?
Like we said, we did have a little bit of problem, but I am such a George Perez fan. I felt so bad when he passed away. That was my childhood. I really like that one, and I really like the Krypto one especially. Those were probably my two favorites. And the Jimmy Olsen. That was really good, too.
I can't help but nitpick, but man, I do still love that Perez Superman. And you're right, too. The comic book industry doesn't feel correct. There's something off about the comic industry that doesn't have George Perez a part of it anymore. I definitely miss him. I miss his work. I will always cherish the work that he's done. I also loved the Shazam from the Hero File. That's just such a great, big, cartoony version of the character. And I also enjoy the villains in the mix as well.
I'm not sure that this review of Steel offered any headway into the plot I've been drawn into. And in fact, I'm now unsure if the Golden Age was as key to this case as I had thought. Maybe it was the obscurity of the characters that was important, or some other factor that I'm missing. Chuck brought up a number of heroes that had survived into and originated from the 1950s. Maybe I needed to add a touch of silver to my search terms. As I ponder the matter, let me check to see if I can gather further insights from confidential Communiqués. A World on Fire, JSA All-Star Squadron Earth 2 podcast, Alan Boise Jr., Dr. Ange, who added, Shaken Lois for the win, Ask Him the Writer, The Bat Pod, Between the Pages blog, Billy D., Billy Hines, Comics Enabler and Victim, who added, Vigilante was Robinson, Sammons, and a bit of Blevins. Chiarello covers and colors. On J.H. Williams, he's an excellent mimic. He did the Black Glove Batman arc with the Club of Batman, channeling Adams, Golden, Shaken, and more on different characters. He and Blackman's Echo Lands does it large. Bobo Golan, Soylent, Greenberg. Captain Entropy, who added, Frank, I haven't been writing, but I want you to know that I've loved every one of these DC Secret Files podcasts. David Gallagher's episode was a special treat, and I wish I'd been in the conversation with you, but they're all great. I know these episodes are a ton of work, and sometimes real-life chores or getting a break will take precedence. Just don't ever tell yourself no one's enjoying them. The framing sequences and the way you plan ahead are most impressive, as Liz Ann would say. I really appreciate you letting me join in too. Frank, is that the kind of comment you needed? I'm trying to support this weird legend you've come up with, where all your ops and intel reporting is just content for a fictional podcast. I'm really curious whether they loved or hated this kind of creativity when you were in training. Oh, forgot to mention, this is your captain speaking. Chris at Bad Books for Beginners. Clovis Forever. Dave's Comic Heroes blog, DC Dave, Dr. Pop Culture. Doug Adamson wrote of Shag, you know you don't have to rescue him, it's not mandatory. Ed Moore, Teal Productions. Elodie Wells, Flanger, who added a pants emoji to the wide variety of trial options folks offered on Discord. The Spy remains the most popular, but I also like the file folder. The Superman shield was well represented last time, and I expect even more of that for this episode. He also added on Discord, I'm no fan of podcasts with weird pretend scenarios at the start. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Future moments. GB Blackrock, who wrote, I had the honor of being a guest for the latest episode of the DC Secret Files podcast. Go for No. The Hammer Strikes, Random Geeky Stuff. History of Comics on Film. Into the Weird. Jan Merriam. Jim Imbruglia, SCTV Forever. Justice Society Presents. Keith G. Baker. Ken Hazlitt. Long Box of Darkness. Martin Gray. Mary Rose. Matt Anderson. Peacemaker, What a Joke. Ron Fortier. Scott X. Sean Chronoguardian. And finally, Siskoid, who wrote of segments like this. I mean, I have a billion shows and I've never done that. Says something. Yes, and?
Is there any place on the internet that you would like to direct people to? Any appearances on other podcasts, anything like that?
The only place I am, I'm Dr. Pop Culture USA on Twitter or X and Blue Sky. That's where people can find me. And right now I'm in the middle of pushing. We're going to be having a conference on soap operas in late October. If you go to either of those sites, you'll see me shilling a lot for people to come to our conference to talk about things like Days of Our Lives and Dallas and Dynasty and Dark Shadows.
And see, I just love the scope of your interests. You know, that's one of the great things when I see you posting stuff on Blue Sky is I just don't know what's going to come out of you at any particular given moment. And I just love that breadth of information you have.
Somebody asked, is it all well planned? No. It's all kind of spur of the moment. I have to give you a lot of credit for getting this all together and planning it out in advance because I'm so disorganized compared to you. Bravo for this.
I got to tell you, though, when I told my gal who I was recording with, she was so fascinated by the concept of a doctor of pop culture. How do you get a degree in that? And what does he teach? And is he a professor? And she just kept riddling me with questions about what you do. You found such a fascinating lane for yourself. I love all the stuff that you put out there to the world.
I'll just mention one last one because we're almost out of time. Some of your listeners might know of the Comic Geek Speak. One of our alumni is Adam Murdo from CGS. And he actually wrote his master's thesis on Crisis on Infinite Earths. So you can get a master's degree in this stuff, believe it or not.
I mean, if you needed a master's in something, that's a good text to work off of. That's going to be impressive at every level.
Target acquired. Just as I wrapped up with Dr. Pop Culture, I received a ping from my scanning of any mentions of myself among the communications channels of state and federal authorities. They made the vehicle that Captain Entropy had used to transport me out here, and now I'm afraid that the rescuer may need rescuing himself.
Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I've been Frank.
Oh, and I'm Chuck.
As always, we leave you with a question for the next episode.
Do you want to hear a secret?